My name is Jason, and I am 15 years old. Last month, my parents and younger sister went on a trip to Texas, leaving me alone at home. I was excited at first, thinking I could watch as many movies and eat as much junk food as I wanted. But things took a dark turn one rainy night, a night I will never forget. It was a Friday evening, and the rain was pouring heavily outside. I had spent most of the day playing video games and texting my friends. By 11 p.m., I decided it was time to go to bed. I climbed under the covers, turned off the lights, and tried to sleep, listening to the sound of the rain tapping against my window. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise downstairs. It sounded like someone talking. At first, I thought maybe my parents had returned early from their trip, but then I remembered they said they wouldn't be back until Monday. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was still there, soft and indistinct, but curiosity got the better of me. I got out of bed and slowly crept towards my bedroom door. I opened it just a crack and peered out into the dark hallway. The house was eerily silent, except for the faint murmur coming from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate. I tiptoed down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the bottom, I stopped and listened again. The voice was clearer now, but I couldn't make out any words. It sounded like it was coming from the living room. I took a deep breath and walked towards the sound, my heart thudding in my ears. As I approached the living room, there was a loud bang, like someone had slammed a door. I froze, my blood running cold. I quickly looked around the corner into the hallway, and that's when I saw him. A shadowy figure stood at the end of the hallway. He was tall and dressed in black, his features obscured by the darkness. I gasped and stumbled back, my mind racing. Who was this man? How did he get into my house? My first instinct was to run back to my room. I dashed up the stairs, my heart pounding louder than ever. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I reached my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, my voice trembling with fear. She assured me that the police were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I could hear the intruder moving around downstairs. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do next. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens approaching. The intruder must have heard them too, because the noises from downstairs suddenly stopped. I listened intently, but everything was quiet. A few minutes later, I heard a loud knock on the front door and the sound of voices. The police had arrived. I cautiously opened my bedroom door and made my way downstairs. 2 police officers were in the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I explained what had happened, my voice still shaking. They searched the house thoroughly, but found no sign of the intruder. The front door was unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The officers took my statement and reassured me that they would patrol the area throughout the night. They advised me to stay with a neighbor or a relative until my parents returned, but I didn't want to leave my house. They promised to keep a close watch and left me with their contact information. After the police left, I tried to calm down, but the fear lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadowy figure and what his intentions might have been. Why was he in my house? What was he looking for? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. When morning finally came, I felt a little better, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were shocked and promised to cut their trip short and come home as soon as possible. The next few days were a blur. My parents returned and we installed a new security system in the house. The police continued to investigate, but they never found any leads. I don't know who the intruder was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I will never forget the night I came face to face with the unknown. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. When I was 37, I decided to attend my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport, rented a car, and started the 35-mile drive to my hometown. The road led through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. It felt a little eerie driving through those empty fields and silent woods. About 3 miles outside of town, I saw someone on the side of the road flagging me down. I slowed down and recognized the guy as Jim, one of my old high school friends. We hadn't seen each other in 20 years, but he looked almost the same, just a bit older. Jim climbed into the car and we started talking. We caught up on old times and laughed about some of the pranks we pulled back in school. It felt good to see a familiar face after so many years. As we approached town, I asked him if he wanted to come to the VFW for a drink with me. "No, just take me home," Jim said. I remembered that his parents used to live only a few blocks from my grandmother's house, so I turned in that direction. But Jim stopped me, saying, "Take me to the outskirts of town." There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that must be where he lived now. When we reached the turnoff, Jim said, "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again." Then he got out and walked off into the night. I drove to the VFW and met some of my old classmates. We started chatting about who was coming to the reunion. At some point, I mentioned that I had just picked Jim up 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off. Suddenly, everyone got quiet. Even the guy singing karaoke stopped and put down the microphone. My cousin, who was sitting next to me, went as white as a new t-shirt. "Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all at his funeral," someone said. I felt dizzy and lightheaded. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mumbled something about needing some air and went out to the car to take a few deep breaths. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed a newspaper on the passenger seat. I picked it up, and my heart nearly stopped. It was the local newspaper, printed 8 years ago, and it had Jim's obituary on the front page. I stared at it in disbelief, my hands shaking. The obituary confirmed what my classmates had said. Jim had died in a car accident on that curve outside of town. The article described how he had lost control of his car and rolled it into a ditch. He had died on impact. I didn't know what to think. I had just seen Jim, talked to him, and given him a ride. How could he be dead? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I needed to know more, so I decided to visit Jim's old house the next day. The next morning, I drove to Jim's parents' house. I knocked on the door, and Jim's mother answered. She looked older and worn down, the grief still evident in her eyes. I introduced myself and told her about the strange encounter I had the previous night. Her eyes widened and she invited me in. She explained that after Jim died, many people claimed to have seen him around town, always near the place where he had crashed. Some thought it was just their imagination. Others believed it was Jim's spirit, unable to move on. I asked her if she had experienced anything herself. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and said, "Sometimes I feel his presence in the house. I hear his favorite song playing on the radio when it's not even on. It's like he's still here watching over us." I left Jim's house feeling a mixture of sadness and confusion. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jim and the strange encounter. I wondered if he had tried to tell me something, if there was a reason he had appeared to me. A few days later, the reunion came to an end, and I had to head back home. As I drove past the spot where I had picked Jim up, I slowed down and looked around. The road was empty, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I still have that old newspaper with Jim's obituary. I keep it as a reminder of that strange night. Whenever I think about it, I get a feeling that there's more to this world than we can see or understand. Maybe Jim just wanted to say goodbye, or maybe he had unfinished business. Whatever the reason, I'll never forget the night I gave a ride to my old friend Jim and discovered that sometimes the past is closer than we think. I had always loved the idea of camping alone in the forest. The thought of being surrounded by nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, filled me with excitement. So, one Friday afternoon, I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and some food, and drove to the edge of the dark forest. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and began my hike deep into the woods. The sun was still shining brightly when I reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. The trees stood tall and dense, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. Birds chirped happily, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small campfire. As the sun began to set, the forest around me slowly turned dark. Night fell, and the forest became eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of my campfire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, staring up at the star-filled sky, feeling both alone and alive. Suddenly, I heard a rustle in the bushes nearby. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just an animal. I tried to relax, but the noise continued, getting louder and closer. I sat up, straining my eyes to see into the darkness beyond the flickering light of the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the bushes. The beam of light revealed nothing but leaves and branches swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and decided it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still feeling uneasy, I added more wood to the fire and sat closer to it, hoping the flames would keep any curious animals away. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Hours passed, and I finally started to feel sleepy. Just as I was about to crawl back into my tent, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves. My blood ran cold. This was no animal. Someone was out there, walking towards my camp. "Who's there?" I shouted again, my voice echoing through the silent forest. Still there was no reply. I grabbed a large stick from the ground, holding it tightly as I stood by the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then I saw him. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, just beyond the reach of my firelight. He stood still, staring at me. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his eyes on me. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to get away from him. I slowly backed towards my tent, keeping my eyes on the figure. My mind raced, thinking of what to do next. Without warning, the man started moving towards me, his steps quick and purposeful. My instincts took over, and I turned and ran into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness was disorienting, but I didn't dare stop. Branches scratched my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush. But I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, limping as fast as I could. I could see the faint glow of moonlight through the trees, guiding me towards what I hoped was safety. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into another clearing. To my relief, I saw a small cabin with lights on inside. I limped towards it, banging on the door frantically. "Help, please help me!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The door opened, and an old man stood there looking startled. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. "There's someone after me. Please, let me in," I cried, glancing over my shoulder. The man stepped aside, and I rushed inside, collapsing onto the floor. He quickly shut and locked the door, peering out the window. "There's no one there," he said, turning to me. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, still shaking with fear. "He was there. He was chasing me." The old man nodded slowly and handed me a blanket. "You can stay here tonight. We'll sort this out in the morning." I thanked him, my voice barely above a whisper. As I sat on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, I finally felt a sense of safety. The old man sat nearby, keeping an eye on the door. Despite my fear, exhaustion soon took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When morning came, the old man and I walked back to my campsite. There was no sign of the stranger, but the fear of that night stayed with me. I packed up my things and left the forest, vowing never to camp alone again. The peaceful solitude I once craved had turned into a nightmare I would never forget. Working as a nurse in a mental health facility can be very challenging. I've always been calm and collected, but one night something happened that shook me to my core. It was a night I will never forget. It was a quiet Thursday evening. The sun had set, and the moonlight was casting long shadows on the walls. I was on the night shift at St. Anne's mental health facility, a place that had seen many troubled souls over the years. Some of the patients were quiet, while others could be violent. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and narrow hallways. My shift started at 8 p.m. The air was cool, and the night felt normal. I did my rounds, checking on the patients and making sure they were comfortable and had taken their medication. Everything seemed fine, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like something was watching me. At around midnight, I was in the nurse's station, updating patient record. The dim light from the lamp on my desk was the only light in the room. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper. I paused, listening carefully. It was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. Shrugging it off, I continued my work. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. It sounded like someone was calling my name. "Emily. Emily." My heart started to race. I stood up and looked around, but there was no one there. The hallway outside the station was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to do another round to check on the patients. As I walked through the dark hallways, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I reached the end of the hall where room 307 was. The patient in that room, Mrs. Thompson, was known for her quiet demeanor. She rarely spoke and spent most of her time staring out the window. As I approached her room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Mrs. Thompson was sitting in her usual spot by the window, but something was different. She was humming a strange tune, something I had never heard before. Her eyes were fixed on the moon outside, and she didn't seem to notice I was there. "Mrs. Thompson," I called softly. She didn't respond. I walked closer and gently touched her shoulder. She stopped humming and turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide and she whispered, "They're here." "Who's here, Mrs. Thompson?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The shadows," she said, her voice trembling. "They come at night, they whisper, they want to take me." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I tried to comfort her, but she kept repeating the same words, "The shadows, the shadows." I left her room, feeling uneasy. As I walked back to the nurse's station, the lights flickered. The whispering started again, louder this time. "Emily, Emily," it echoed through the hallway. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the nurse's station, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The whispering grew louder, and now I could hear multiple voices. "Emily, come play with us. Join us." I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the papers on my desk fluttered to the floor. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move at the edge of the light. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady the flashlight. I decided to check the security cameras to see if there was anyone else in the building. The monitors were in a small room next to the nurse's station. I rushed in and turned on the screens. Most of the cameras showed empty hallways and rooms, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the camera view of the hallway outside room 307, shadows were moving. They didn't have a clear shape. They were just dark, shifting forms, and they were moving towards the nurse's station. Towards me. I couldn't breathe. I watched in horror as the shadows got closer and closer. I grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. The whispering was all around me now, louder than ever. "Emily, join us, forever." I backed into the corner of the room, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The shadows reached the door, and I felt an icy chill wash over me. The door creaked open, and the room grew even darker. The whispers were deafening. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the shadows vanished. The whispering stopped. I was left standing in the bright light, trembling and gasping for air. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary place. There was something evil here, something that fed on the fear of the patients and the staff. The rest of the night was a blur. I somehow managed to finish my shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. When morning finally came, I handed over to the day nurse and left the facility as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? That night changed everything. I realized that some things cannot be explained, and there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. I never worked another night shift at St. Anne's. The memory of that night still haunts me, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear the whispering. I had just moved into my new apartment. It was a small, cozy place, perfect for me. The walls were painted a soft blue, and the living room had a big window that let in lots of sunlight during the day. I was happy to have my own space after living with roommates for so long. One evening, after unpacking most of my boxes, I decided to relax. I made a cup of tea and settled down on the couch with a good book. The apartment was quiet, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. As I read, I began to feel sleepy. The warmth of the tea and the comfort of the couch made my eyes heavy. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise. It was a faint scratching sound, like someone was gently scraping something against my front door. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought. I tried to ignore it and went back to my book. But then I heard it again, this time louder and more insistent. It sounded like someone was trying to unlock the door from the outside. I put my book down and tiptoed to the door. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The hallway outside was dark and empty. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, but the noise stopped. Maybe I was just imagining things, I told myself. I went back to the couch, but I couldn't concentrate on my book anymore. My mind kept wandering back to the strange noise. I turned on the TV to distract myself, hoping some background noise would calm my nerves. A few hours passed, and I started to feel a bit more relaxed. I decided to go to bed. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and crawled under the covers. The bed was warm and comfortable, and I soon fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why, but then I heard it again, the same scratching noise at the door. This time, it was louder and more frantic. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my phone and looked at the time. It was 2:30 a.m. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The noise continued, and I could hear the handle of the door rattling as if someone was trying to force it open. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I try to scare them off by shouting? My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered into the phone, explaining what was happening. They assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay calm and keep quiet. I stayed on the phone, clutching it tightly, listening to the operator's soothing voice. The noise at the door grew louder. I could hear heavy breathing and a low, menacing voice muttering something I couldn't understand. It felt like an eternity, but finally I heard sirens in the distance. The sound of the sirens seemed to startle the intruder. The rattling stopped, and everything went silent. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move. After what felt like an eternity, there was a loud knock on the door, followed by a voice announcing it was the police. I slowly got out of bed and walked to the door. My legs felt like jelly, and my heart was still racing. I opened the door to find two police officers standing there. They looked serious and concerned. I told them what had happened, and they took a quick look around the apartment and the hallway. Whoever it was, they're gone now, one of the officers said. But we'll stay here for a while, just to be sure. I thanked them, feeling a bit more at ease with their presence. The officers stayed for about an hour, patrolling the area and making sure everything was safe. They told me to call again if anything happened, and then left. I locked the door behind them and double-checked all the windows. Despite their reassurance, I still felt uneasy. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining the intruder coming back. The next day, I called the building manager and told them what had happened. They promised to check the security cameras and improve the lighting in the hallway. I also decided to buy a new, stronger lock for my door. Days passed and nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every night I would hear noises, creaks, whispers, soft footsteps, but whenever I checked, there was nothing there. I tried to go on with my life, but the fear stayed with me. I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I hoped that one day I would feel safe again in my own home, but for now, the memory of that night haunted me. The intruder had vanished without a trace, leaving only fear and unanswered questions in his wake. And though the police assured me that he was gone, I couldn't help but wonder if he would come back and what he wanted in the first place. My name is Tom, and I work as a delivery guy for a small diner called Maggie's Place. I've been doing this job for a few months now, and I've never had any problems. Until that night, the night I'll never forget. It was a chilly evening in late October, just a few days before Halloween. The sky was dark and the moon hid behind thick clouds. I was getting ready to end my shift when the phone rang. It was an order for a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. Nothing unusual about that. The address, however, was unfamiliar to me. I checked the map on my phone and saw that it was in a part of town I rarely visited. An old street called Maple Avenue. I didn't think much of it and packed up the order. I put on my jacket, grabbed the food, and headed out to my car. The drive to Maple Avenue was longer than I expected. The streets were getting quieter and darker as I went along. Finally, I turned onto Maple Avenue. It was an old street, lined with big trees and even bigger houses, but something felt off. The street was empty, not a single car parked along the curb, and the houses looked dark and abandoned. I found the house number 103 at the end of the street. It was a large, old house with peeling paint and broken windows. The yard was overgrown, and the gate creaked as I pushed it open. I walked up to the front door and knocked. The sound echoed through the empty house. I waited, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I was about to leave when I heard a voice from above. "I'm coming," the voice said. I looked up and saw a shadowy figure in the upper window. I couldn't see the person's face, but I was relieved that someone was home. I waited on the porch, holding the food, but no one came down. I called out, "Hello? Your food is here." There was no response. I checked my phone to see if I had the right address. It was correct. I tried calling the number on the order slip, but it went straight to voicemail. As I stood there feeling more and more uneasy, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly and saw an old woman standing on the sidewalk. She was staring at me with a concerned look on her face. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. "Yes, I have a delivery for this house," I replied, pointing to 103. "But no one is answering the door." The old woman's eyes widened, and she shook her head slowly. "No one lives there," she said. "That house has been abandoned for years. It's haunted." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Haunted? Are you sure?" She nodded. "People say they hear voices and see shadows in the windows, but no one lives there. It's been empty since the family that owned it died in a fire." I didn't know what to say. The old woman seemed sincere, and the house did look like it had been abandoned for a long time. I turned back to the house and felt a shiver of fear. What was going on? Who had placed the order? I decided to leave the food on the porch and go. As I was walking back to my car, I heard the voice again, louder this time. I'm coming. I turned around, but no one was there. The porch was empty, and the house was silent. I ran to my car, got in, and drove away as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. When I got back to the diner, Maggie, the owner, noticed my pale face and asked what was wrong. I told her everything. She listened carefully, then sighed. Maple Avenue, huh? I've heard stories about that place. It's been abandoned for over a decade. Must have been a prank call. A prank call? It didn't feel like a prank. It felt real, too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had happened. I finished my shift and went home, but I couldn't sleep that night. The voice, the shadow in the window, the old woman's warning, it all kept replaying in my mind. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I did some research on the house at 103 Maple Avenue. I found old newspaper articles about a fire that had destroyed the house 15 years ago. A family of 4 had died in the blaze. The house had been abandoned ever since. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I've never gone back to Maple Avenue. Every time I pass by that part of town, I get a chill down my spine. And whenever I hear someone say, "I'm coming," I remember that night and the abandoned house with the shadow in the window. It was a chilly autumn evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. We had always heard stories about strange creatures and spooky sightings there, but were too curious to stay away. Tristan, Bobby, Sarah, and I thought it would be fun to see if any of those tales were true. The factory was a huge, crumbling building with broken windows and rusted metal doors. As we approached, the wind howled through the empty halls, sending chills down my spine. We squeezed through a gap in the fence and made our way inside, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. "Let's check out the elevator shaft," Tristan suggested. He was always the bravest of us, or maybe just the most foolish. Either way, we followed him through the dark corridors. When we reached the elevator shaft, Tristan peered into the darkness below. "I think I see something," he whispered. I leaned in closer, straining my eyes. For a moment, I saw a faint silhouette, like a person standing there, but then it was gone. "Probably just a trick of the light," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. Bobby, always the skeptic, snorted. "You guys are just imagining things. There's no such thing as ghosts or monsters." We moved on, exploring the different rooms and floors of the factory. The place was filled with old machinery, broken furniture, and piles of debris. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. As we made our way to the upper floors, Bobby suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all listened, holding our breath. There it was, a faint rustling sound, like something moving quickly across the floor. "It's probably just rats," Sarah said, but her voice was shaky. We continued, but now there was a sense of unease hanging over us. In one of the larger rooms, we found a makeshift camp. There were old blankets, empty cans, and a small fire pit. "Looks like someone has been staying here," I said. "Maybe it's just a homeless person," Tristan suggested. That would explain the noises and the silhouette. We decided to leave, feeling like we had seen enough. As we made our way back to the entrance, Bobby pointed to a shadowy figure darting across the hallway ahead of us. It moved so quickly, it was almost a blur. "Did you see that?" he asked, his face pale. "There's someone here." We quickened our pace, hearts pounding. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. We all turned to see a dark figure standing at the end of the hall, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with long, bony fingers. "Run!" Tristan shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted down the hall, the figure behind us. As we reached the stairs, I glanced back and saw it standing there, watching us. Its eyes seemed to bore into my soul. We burst out of the factory, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, far from the eerie building. We stood there, panting and wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what we had just experienced. "Maybe it was just a person," I said, though I didn't believe it. The way that figure had moved, the glowing eyes, it didn't seem human. Bobby nodded, but he still looked shaken. "Yeah, maybe, but it didn't feel like it." Tristan, usually so confident, was unusually quiet. "I don't know what it was, but I don't want to go back there again." Sarah shivered. "Me neither. That place is cursed." As we walked home, we tried to laugh it off, to make light of what we had seen. But deep down, we all knew that something strange had happened that night. We couldn't explain it, and maybe we never would. Even now, Years later, I sometimes think about that night at the factory. Whenever I hear strange noises in the dark or see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I remember the glowing eyes and the feeling of being watched. Some things are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. It was a dark and stormy night. Rain battered the windows of the old, creaky hotel where I worked the night shift. My name is Alex, and I am the night receptionist at the Moonlight Inn. The hotel had seen better days. Its once bright red carpets were now faded and worn, and the wallpaper was peeling in many places. There were only a few guests tonight, most of them already asleep in their rooms. As I sat at the front desk, listening to the rain and the occasional roll of thunder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet, too still. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the front door creaking open. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. He was soaked to the bone, water dripping from his long, dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his piercing eyes staring straight at me. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm. "How can I help you?" The man stepped forward, leaving a trail of water behind him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet, placing it on the counter. "I need a room," he said in a low, raspy voice. His tone sent a shiver down my spine. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," he replied curtly. "But I need a room. Now." There was something about him that made me uneasy. His clothes looked expensive, but old-fashioned, like he had stepped out of another time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen his face somewhere before, but I couldn't place it. "I'll need to see some ID," I said, trying to stick to the hotel's policy. The man hesitated, then reluctantly handed me his driver's license. I glanced at it quickly, noting his name was Jack Harrison. As I handed it back to him, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Room 13 is available," I said, handing him a key. It was the only room left on the ground floor. "Enjoy your stay." Jack took the key without a word and headed down the dimly lit hallway. I watched him go, a feeling of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. As the hours passed, the rain continued to pour outside, and the wind howled around the old building. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to Jack. Something about him wasn't right. I decided to do a quick search online, just to ease my mind. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a news article from a few years ago about a man named Jack Harrison, who had been wanted for a series of violent crimes. He had disappeared without a trace, and the police had been searching for him ever since. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the operator, my voice barely above a whisper. They assured me that the police would be there soon. I hung up and tried to stay calm. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, listening for any sound from room 13. Finally, I heard the faint wail of sirens approaching. 2 police officers entered the hotel, their faces serious. "Where is he?" one of them asked. I pointed down the hallway. "Room 13. They nodded and moved quickly, silently down the corridor. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The officers knocked on the door. "Mr. Harrison, this is the police. We need to speak with you." There was no response. They knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Harrison, open the door." Still nothing. One of the officers motioned for me to come closer. "Do you have a master key?" I nodded and handed it to him with trembling hands. He unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. The window was open, rain blowing in and soaking the carpet. The officers exchanged a look, then turned to me. "Are you sure this is the right room?" one of them asked. "Yes," I stammered. "He was here. I gave him the key myself." The officers searched the room thoroughly, but there was no sign of Jack Harrison. It was like he had vanished into thin air. "Call us if you see him again," one of the officers said, handing me a card. "And keep the doors locked." I nodded, still in shock. They left, and I was alone again in the eerie silence of the hotel. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Jack Harrison. Where had he gone? How had he disappeared so quickly? I watched the security footage, but there was no sign of him leaving the building. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to ease. The other staff started to arrive for their shifts, and I explained what had happened. They were just as baffled as I was. To this day, I still don't know what became of Jack Harrison. Some say he's still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. All I know is that I'll never forget that stormy night at the Moonlight Inn, and the strange man who vanished without a trace. When I was 16, my mom, my sister Lisa, and I decided to drive across the country. It was a long trip, but we were excited to see new places. Lisa was 20 at the time, and we had been planning this trip for months. We packed our bags, filled up the car, and hit the road. We had been driving for days, taking turns behind the wheel. It was late, but we were still well rested and alert. We were driving along a lonely interstate when we realized we needed gas and a bathroom break. The nearest rest stop was the only one for 200 miles, so we decided to stop there. When we pulled into the rest stop, everything felt wrong. It was dark and quiet, unlike any other rest stop we had visited during our trip. We saw a van full of teenagers parked at the gas station and a small gray car in front of us with two young men standing outside it. The teenagers looked scared and were trying to get the pump to work. They quickly left, saying something about how they were creeped out. My mom and Lisa went inside to use the bathroom and I stayed in the car. I couldn't take my eyes off the two men standing by the gray car. They didn't move at all. They weren't talking or using their phones. They just stood there, still as statues. I started to feel uneasy and wished my mom and Lisa would hurry up. Finally, they came running back to the car looking scared. As they got in, the two men slowly turned their heads to look at us. They didn't move their bodies, just their heads. And that's when we saw their eyes. Their eyes were dark as pitch, empty. It wasn't just black, it was like a void, a space where light didn't exist. We all saw it and it terrified us. We didn't waste any time. My mom started the car and we sped out of there as fast as we could. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next city. Once we felt safe, we tried to figure out what had happened. We looked at maps, both on paper and on Google, but we couldn't find the rest stop anywhere. It was like it didn't exist. We even asked locals about a creepy gas station on that stretch of the interstate, but no one knew what we were talking about. It was as if the place had vanished. Since then, we've traveled on that interstate a few more times, but we've never seen that rest stop again. It was like it had been a ghost, a figment of our imagination. But we all knew what we saw, and it still haunts us to this day. That night changed us. We don't talk about it much, but I can see the fear in my mom's and Lisa's eyes whenever we pass that part of the road. It's a memory that won't fade, a reminder of the unknown lurking out there in the darkness. I work as a delivery man, and my shift starts at 10 p.m. It's a tough job, especially at night, but it pays well. I usually deliver food around the city, driving my old car through the quiet streets. The night is peaceful, but sometimes it can be a little eerie. One Friday night around midnight, I got an order from a part of town I didn't recognize. The address was strange, and it took me longer than usual to find it. When I finally arrived, I saw a big old house at the end of a long, dark road. There were no streetlights, and the house looked abandoned. The windows were broken, and the paint was peeling off the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I had a job to do. I parked my car and grabbed the bag of food. As I walked towards the house, I noticed how silent it was. Not a single sound, not even the rustling of leaves. I reached the front door and knocked. The door creaked open by itself, and I hesitated. But then I heard a voice from inside. "Come in," the voice said. It was soft and low, almost a whisper. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me. The house was dark, with only a few candles lighting the hallway. The air was cold and damp. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing. As I reached the end, I saw a door slightly ajar. The voice came from there. "Bring it here," the voice said again. I pushed the door open and entered the room. It was pitch dark, except for a single candle on a table in the corner. The flickering light cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could barely see anything, but I sensed someone was in the room with me. "Where do you want me to put the food?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Over here," the voice replied. It sounded closer now, almost right next to me. I walked towards the table, my heart pounding in my chest. As I put the bag down, I saw a figure standing in the darkness. It was tall and thin, with long, bony fingers. The figure stepped into the candlelight, and I gasped. It was a woman, but her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were hollow, dark pits. She smiled, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. "Thank you for bringing the food," she said, her voice now raspy and menacing. "Stay a while, won't you?" I took a step back, feeling the fear rising inside me. I have to go. I have more deliveries," I stammered. She moved closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, stay. We rarely have visitors. It gets lonely here." My mind raced, thinking of a way to escape. I glanced at the door, but she was blocking my path. Suddenly, I remembered my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out, pretending to check something. "I have to go. My boss is calling," I lied, trying to sound convincing. She tilted her head, studying me. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't let me leave. But then she stepped back and smiled that eerie smile again. "Very well, but you will come back, won't you?" she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Sure," I said, not meaning it at all. "I'll be back." I turned and walked quickly towards the door. As I reached the hallway, I heard her laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't look back. I ran down the hallway and out the front door, not stopping until I reached my car. I jumped in and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the doorway, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. I sped down the dark road, my heart pounding. When I finally reached the main street, I pulled over and tried to catch my breath. What had just happened? Who was that woman? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The rest of the night was a blur. I finished my deliveries, but my mind kept drifting back to that old house and the eerie woman inside. When my shift ended, I drove home and collapsed on my bed, exhausted and scared. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They laughed and said I must have been imagining things. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. I never went back to that part of town again. I used to work for a relatively small security company. It was a quiet job, mostly just sitting in empty buildings, making sure everything was safe. My name is Tom, and I've been doing this job for a few years now, but there's one night I'll never forget. It was a chilly October evening when I got assigned to watch over an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place gave me the creeps from the moment I arrived. The windows were broken, and the wind howled through the empty halls, but I needed the paycheck, so I sucked it up and got to work. As the sun set and darkness settled over the building, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was just an old building, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew there was something off about that place. I did my rounds, checking every corner of the hospital, making sure no one had snuck in. Everything seemed normal until I reached the basement. The air down there was thick and musty, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I descended the stairs. The basement was dark, barely illuminated by the dim glow of my flashlight. I shone it around, trying to make out my surroundings, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I knew I had to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I started to back away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I let out a scream and turned to run, but something grabbed hold of my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. I scrambled to get away, kicking and thrashing against whatever had me trapped. But it was no use. Whatever it was too strong, dragging me further into the darkness. I fought against it with everything I had, but it was like trying to wrestle with a shadow. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I felt it release its grip and I scrambled to my feet, sprinting up the stairs and out of the basement. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air and covered in sweat. I looked back at the hospital, half expecting to see whatever had attacked me chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouette of the building against the night sky. I stumbled back to my car, shaking from head to toe. I didn't know what I had encountered down there, but I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to go back. I quit my job the next day, telling my boss I needed a break from security work. But deep down, I knew the real reason. I was terrified of what lurked in the shadows of that old hospital. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that low, guttural growl echoing in the darkness. A reminder of the horrors that lurk just out of sight. A couple of years ago, I was home alone, enjoying a rare night of peace. My parents had gone out for a dinner date, and my siblings were away at college. I was looking forward to a night of binge-watching my favorite TV show and indulging in some guilty pleasure snacks. As I settled into the couch, I noticed that the house was eerily quiet. The creaks and groans of the old wooden floorboards seemed louder than usual, and the wind outside seemed to be whispering strange melodies. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, the strange noises grew louder and more frequent. I heard footsteps outside my room and the sound of someone rummaging through the kitchen. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to investigate, my heart racing with anticipation. I slowly got up from the couch and made my way to the kitchen, my senses on high alert. As I entered the kitchen, I was met with an unsettling sight. The lights were on, and the room was spotless, but there was a feeling of unease in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and I could make out the words, "Get out while you still can." I knew then that I had to act fast. I quickly grabbed my phone and dashed to the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I realized it was locked. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder and more menacing, and I knew I had to think fast. I ran back to the living room and grabbed a nearby vase, ready to defend myself if necessary. As I stood there frozen with fear, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They were heavy and deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I raised the vase, ready to strike, but as the figure entered the room, I realized it was not what I expected. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. She was dressed in a long white gown, and she moved with a slow, deliberate pace. As she approached me, I could feel a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, but instead she reached out a bony hand and touched my face. I felt a surge of electricity run through my body, and suddenly I was flooded with visions of the past. I saw a family, happy and laughing, but also a tragedy, a loss that seemed to consume them all. I saw the woman standing in the same spot, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. As the visions faded, I realized that the woman was a ghost, trapped in our home for decades. And I knew that I had to help her find peace. With a newfound sense of courage, I reached out and took her hand. Together, we walked through the house, uncovering secrets and memories that had been hidden for years. As we reached the front door, I knew it was time to let her go. I opened the door and she vanished into the night, her eyes finally at peace. As I stood there, feeling a sense of relief wash over me, I knew that I would never forget this night. I had faced my fears and helped a lost soul find peace, and I knew that I would always be grateful for that. This happened to me last summer when I was back at my parents' house during the holidays. I had just finished college and was looking forward to a relaxing break. My parents' house is in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that cast long shadows at night. It's a cozy place, but it can feel a bit creepy when you're alone at night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was in my room, scrolling through my phone. I was wide awake, despite the late hour. Suddenly, my phone rang, and I saw my sister's name on the screen. That was already a bit weird, since her room was just down the hallway from mine, and she could have just come in and talked to me. But I picked up the phone anyway, and as soon as I said hello, the call ended. I thought maybe she had hung up by mistake, so I got out of bed and walked down the hallway to her room. As soon as I reached her door, I heard her screaming. It was a loud, terrified scream, and it sent chills down my spine. I quickly opened the door and rushed inside. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear and her face pale. I asked her what was wrong, and she pointed to the corner of the room, her hand shaking. I looked over, but there was no one there. She started crying and told me that she had woken up and seen a dark shadow just centimeters from her face. She said it was tall and menacing, and it had made her feel like she was being suffocated. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a dream, but she insisted that it was real. She said she had called me for help, but when I reminded her that her phone was downstairs in her purse, she looked confused. That's when things started to get weird. I checked my phone, and there was a log of the call from her number, but when we checked her phone, there was no record of the call. It was as if the call had never happened. We were both confused and a bit spooked, so we decided to go downstairs and As we sat in the kitchen, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The house was quiet, but I kept hearing creaks and groans like someone was moving around upstairs. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. We stayed up for a few more hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more we talked, the more confused we became. It was as if we were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Eventually, we went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dark shadow my sister had seen, and the mysterious call that had disappeared from her phone. I started to feel like we were being watched, like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The next day, we told our parents what had happened, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a prank caller or a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what my sister had experienced. It was real, and it was terrifying. After that night, I started to notice strange things around the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I started to feel like I was living in a horror movie, and I didn't know how to escape. I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and I didn't know how to wake up. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house from top to bottom. I looked in every room, every closet, and every corner, but I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. But as I was about to give up, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. "Get out while you still can," it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, and it sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to get out of the house, and fast. I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and started packing. My sister saw me and asked what I was doing, and I told her we had to get out of there. She looked scared, but she didn't argue. We quickly packed our bags and left the house, not looking back. We never went back to that house again, and we never spoke about what happened that summer. But I know that I'll never forget the terror I felt and the feeling. I used to work at City Hall a few years ago as a security guard. It was a quiet job with little to no excitement, but that all changed one fateful night. As part of my duties, I had to patrol the entire building, including the abandoned jail cells in the basement. They hadn't been used in years, but it was still my responsibility to check them regularly for any squatters or trespassers. It was probably my second time patrolling alone when things started to get weird. I made my way down to the old prison holding cells, my flashlight in hand. The hallway was long and narrow, about 6 meters wide and 100 meters long, with cells on both sides. The only light came from bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I walked past the fourth column of cells, the lights suddenly went out. I was plunged into darkness, and my heart started racing. I turned on my flashlight and walked back towards the light switch, my beam dancing across the walls. Right when I was about to flip the switch, the lights flickered back on. I thought to myself, this is strange. I'm getting out of here. But I knew I had to finish my patrol. I started walking faster, quickly checking each cell as I passed. But when I was about halfway down the hallway, the lights went out again. This time I heard 2 cells slam shut, the sound echoing through the hallway. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as I sprinted toward the other end of the hallway. I reached the stairs and took them 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it to catch my breath. I was in the main lobby of City Hall, and it was bustling with people. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from those cells as possible. I made my way to my workstation, my hands shaking as I tried to calm down. I called my supervisor and asked if any electrical issues had been reported. He said no, and I knew I had to tell him what happened. But when I tried to explain, the words caught in my throat. I was stuck at my workstation for the next 2 hours, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have caused the strange occurrences. I was paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something to jump out at me, and when my shift finally ended, I got out of there as fast as I could. I never went back to those cells again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there waiting for me. And I knew I'd never forget the terror I felt that night, running from the darkness and the slamming cells. From that day on, I made sure to avoid the basement at all costs. I took the long way around, even if it meant being late for my rounds. And when I finally left City Hall for good, I knew I'd never miss that place. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the sound of those cells slamming shut. And I know that whatever was down there, it's still waiting for me. I used to work the night shift at a rehab facility where the streets were rough and the patients were rougher. But it was a job that needed doing, and I was proud to be a part of it. The facility was an old building with creaky floors and flickering lights. It was like something out of a horror movie, but I tried to ignore it. My job was to keep an eye on the patients and make sure they didn't get into any trouble. But trouble always seemed to find us. The patients would get restless and start causing a ruckus, and I'd have to calm them down. It was a tough job, but I was good at it. One night I was sitting at the desk watching the monitors when I saw him. A guy standing outside the gate staring up at the camera. He was a big guy with a scruffy beard and a menacing look in his eye. I didn't like the look of him, but I tried to ignore him. He was probably just some local punk trying to cause trouble, but he didn't leave. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was trying to see something. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was too still, too quiet. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. I decided to use the intercom to see if he was okay. "Hey buddy, you need some help?" I said, trying to sound friendly, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was in a trance. I was starting to get creeped out. I called my coworker Mike over to take a look. "What do you think, Mike? This guy's been standing there for 20 minutes, just staring up at the camera." Mike looked at the monitor and his expression turned serious. "I don't like it," he said. "Let's go check it out." We walked out to the gate and the guy was still there staring up at the camera. We approached him and he didn't even flinch. It was like he was in a coma or something. "Hey buddy, you need some help?" Mike said, trying to shake him out of it. But the guy didn't respond. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was trying to see something that wasn't there. We tried to move him, but he wouldn't budge. It was like he was rooted to the spot. We decided to leave him alone, hoping he'd snap out of it eventually. But he didn't. He just kept staring up at the camera for hours. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. And I had a feeling that when it arrived, we were all in trouble. Finally, after 2 hours, he vanished, just disappeared into thin air. We searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was like he never existed, but I knew he did, and I knew he'd be back. I could feel it. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the guy had left a shadow behind, a presence that lingered in the air. And then just as I was leaving my shift, I saw him again, standing outside the gate, staring up at the camera. I knew then that I was in trouble. I knew that he was coming for me. I ran inside, locked the door behind me, and called the police. But when they arrived, he was gone. Again. I never saw him again, but I knew he was still out there, watching me, waiting for me. And I knew that next time he wouldn't just stare. He'd come for me, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. I quit my job that day, and couldn't take the feeling of being watched anymore. But I know that I'll never forget that guy, standing outside the gate, staring up at the camera. He was a reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are real, and they're coming for us. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was in the office late at night working on an important project. The clock on my computer screen showed 2:04 a.m. Everyone else had gone home, leaving me alone in the big office building. The lights hummed and flickered above me, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting to the rumors about the building. Some said it was haunted, built on top of an old Indian burial ground. I didn't believe it, but the darkness and silence of the night made me wonder. As I typed on my keyboard, I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination, but the feeling stayed, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I looked around the office, but there was nobody there. The cubicles were empty, and all the chairs were pushed in. I was alone, trying to focus on my work again. I couldn't shake off the rumors. I thought about scary movies, where someone is always the last one in the office. I remembered the creepy sounds and strange things that happened at night. And then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like the floor was shifting. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the sound grew louder. It sounded like footsteps echoing through the empty office. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. I wanted to leave, but I had to finish my work. So I stayed, trying to ignore the fear building inside me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy and unsteady. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to see or hear anything except the sound of my breathing. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of my cubicle. It was tall and menacing, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I could only watch as the figure moved closer, its eyes fixed on me. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the darkness. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, looming over me like a specter from the beyond. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as it reached out towards me. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. The lights flickered back on, and the office was quiet once again. I sat there, trembling with fear, wondering if what I had seen was real or just a figment of my imagination. I knew then that the rumors were true. The building was haunted, and I had just encountered the malevolent spirit that dwelled within its walls. With trembling hands, I packed up my things and left the office, vowing never to return. As I walked out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back at the darkened windows of the office building, half expecting to see the shadowy figure staring back at me. But there was nothing there, just the empty silence of the night. I never told anyone about what happened that night, fearing they would think I was crazy. But deep down, I knew the truth. The office was haunted, and I had come face to face with its terrifying inhabitant. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if it would ever come back to haunt me again. In 2013, my dad and I hunted in George Washington National Forest near Deerfield. It was a cold, rainy trip, and we struggled to keep our primers dry. The woods were understandably barren, and after about 3 days, we concluded that we were the only humans on the entire east side of Little North Mountain. We hadn't seen a single truck, let alone another hunter. That night, I was jolted awake by a howling scream like nothing I'd heard before, echoing down the mountain from just above camp. It sounded almost human, but not quite. I had my eyes wide open and glued to the ceiling of my tent as my mind raced through all the animals it couldn't possibly be when a second call answered the first. This one closer to the tent, probably less than 300 yards down the washed-out trail that wound its way up the mountain just behind our camp. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my dad, who was stretched out on his cot just across the tent. "Yep," was his one-word answer. "The rifles are in the truck," I whispered back. That was the last time those rifles ever spent the night in the cab of the Tacoma, even during a dank, damp black powder season. The following morning, we were up well before sunrise, joking about Bigfoot and scarfing down breakfast oatmeal before heading out to hunt. 2 forest rangers, not game wardens, forest rangers in uniform pulled up and parked right next to our campsite. Without uttering a word, they slung rifles over their shoulders and headed up the washed-out trail in the direction of the yells we heard the night before. No idea what they were after, but we figured maybe they needed to tell 2 raucous young Sasquatch to keep it down because there were humans in the area. After that, we decided to hunt lower down the mountain. We trudged through the underbrush, our boots squelching in the mud. The forest was thick with mist, and now and then a branch would snap, making us jump. My dad kept glancing over his shoulder, and I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. But we pressed on, determined to bag ourselves a deer before the end of the season. As the day wore on, the mist grew thicker, and the woods seemed to close in around us. It felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes in the shadows following our every move. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We stopped for lunch at a small clearing, the silence of the forest pressing in on us. My dad built a small fire, and we heated some canned soup, eating in silence as the mist curled around us like ghostly fingers. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind us, and we both whipped around, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. My dad nodded, his hand straying to the hunting knife at his belt. We sat there, frozen in place, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the steady drip of water from the trees above. "Maybe it was just a deer," my dad said finally, but I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. We finished our lunch in silence, the unease hanging heavy in the air. As we packed up our gear and headed back into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. We hadn't been walking long when we heard it again, that eerie, howling scream echoing through the forest. My dad stopped dead in his tracks, his hand tightening around the barrel of his rifle. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My dad didn't answer, his eyes scanning the trees as if searching for some unseen threat. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Whatever was out there, it wasn't anything we'd ever encountered before. We kept moving, the howling growing louder with each step we took. It felt like we were walking straight into the jaws of some unseen predator, the tension thick in the air. I wanted to turn back, to run as far away from whatever was out there as I could, but I knew we had to keep going, had to find out what was making that terrible sound. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing, and there, standing in the center of it, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its fur matted and unkempt, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It let out another bone-chilling howl, and my dad raised his rifle, his hands shaking. But before he could aim, the creature vanished into the trees, leaving us standing there alone in the clearing, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My dad shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the forest. "I don't know," he said finally, "but whatever it is, I don't think it's from around here." We stood there for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, the howling growing fainter with each passing moment. And then, without a word, we turned and headed back to camp. The memory of that terrible creature burned into our minds forever. We never did find out what it was that stalked us through the woods that day, but one thing was for certain: we would never forget the terror of that encounter, the feeling of being hunted by something beyond our wildest nightmares. As we packed up our gear and headed back to civilization, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked in the depths of the George Washington National Forest, waiting to be discovered by unsuspecting hunters like us. I was hunting last summer. The woods near my hometown in Oregon were my sanctuary. Every weekend, I'd trek out with my rifle, seeking the peace only nature could offer. But one summer day, everything changed. I set out early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The forest was alive with chirping birds and rustling leaves. It would be a perfect day for hunting, or so I thought. As I trudged deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of nature had gone silent. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that sent shivers down my spine. Ignoring the feeling of unease, I pressed on. But the further I went, the thicker the fog became. Soon I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. Panic started to creep in, but I shook it off. I was an experienced hunter after all. I could handle a little fog. Then out of the mist I saw it, a cabin. It loomed before me, ancient and decrepit, like something out of a horror movie. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached cautiously. I knocked on the door, hoping for some sign of life. But there was no answer. With a shaky hand, I pushed the door open and peered inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. It looked like no one had been there in years. But then, my eyes fell on something that made my blood run cold. A hunting rifle, identical to mine, leaning against the wall. Fear gnawed at my insides as I backed away from the cabin. What was going on? Who did that rifle belong to? And where were they now? I stumbled through the fog, my mind racing with questions, but no matter which way I turned, I couldn't seem to find my way out of the woods. It was like the forest itself was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles. Hours passed, and still I wandered through the fog. Exhaustion weighed heavy on my limbs, and despair threatened to consume me. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw a figure ahead. A man, standing in the clearing. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards him. "Please," I begged, "help me. I'm lost." But as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The man's face was twisted in a grotesque grin, his eyes empty and soulless. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands clawing at my throat. I fought back with all the strength I had, but he was relentless. It was like fighting a demon straight from hell. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard a voice calling my name. Through the haze of pain and fear, I saw a figure emerge from the fog, a woman, with a rifle slung over her shoulder. With a swift motion, she raised the rifle and fired, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap. The man's grip loosened, and he stumbled back, a look of shock on his face. Then, with a final scream, he vanished into the mist, leaving behind nothing but a trail of blood. The woman helped me to my feet, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, still reeling from the encounter. "Thank you," I whispered, "for saving my life." She smiled gently, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You're not the first hunter to stumble into these woods," she said, "and unless we do something about it, you won't be the last." Together, we made our way out of the woods, the fog gradually thinning until we were bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. But even as we left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister still lurked within its depths. And as long as that cabin stood, no one would ever be safe in those woods again. In September, I embarked on a solo hunting trip in the vast wilderness of Wyoming, seeking to bag an antelope. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling hills and endless sagebrush stretching as far as the eye could see. I had been preparing for this trip for months, and finally I was here, surrounded by nature's splendor. As I trekked through the terrain, my senses were on high alert, scanning for any sign of my prey. The sun beat down on me, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I had been walking for hours, and my canteen was almost empty, but I pressed on, driven by my determination to succeed. Suddenly, I spotted my quarry in the distance, a beautiful antelope, its coat glistening in the sunlight. I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The animal dropped, and I felt a rush of excitement and pride. I had done it. As I walked towards my prize, I noticed something peculiar in the distance. A light, incredibly bright and fast-moving, was hurtling towards me. At first, I thought it was a game warden on a side-by-side, coming to check my paperwork. But as the light drew closer, I realized it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The light dove into the sagebrush, disappearing from view. I was perplexed, wondering what it could be. I looked around, but there was nothing in sight. No vehicles, no people, just the endless expanse of wilderness. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was completely alone, with no phone signal to call for help. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, focusing on the task at hand. I tagged the antelope and began field dressing it, my hands moving with a practiced ease. But my mind kept wandering back to the mysterious light. What was it? Where had it come from? And where had it gone? As I finished my task, I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. The light was back, traveling away from me at an incredible speed. It was unlike any vehicle I had ever seen, moving with a fluid grace that defied explanation. I watched in awe, my mind racing with questions. But as the light vanished into the distance, I was left with a sense of unease. I felt like I was being watched, and the silence of the wilderness seemed oppressive. I quickly gathered my gear and began the trek back to my truck, my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could feel eyes upon me, boring into my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The silence was oppressive, and I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could. I finally reached my truck, my heart racing with fear. I tossed my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was safe. But as I drove away from the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. Something that was still out there, watching and waiting. The memory of that mysterious light haunted me, and I knew I would never forget the terror I felt in those lonely hills. From that day on, I avoided hunting alone, always making sure to have a buddy by my side. And when I looked up at the night sky, I couldn't help but wonder if that light was still out there, hurtling through the darkness, searching for its next victim. When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip to a state park. My friend and I were excited to spend our days exploring the woods and our nights telling scary stories around the campfire. But little did we know, our adventure would take a dark and terrifying turn. As we set up our tents, my friend and I decided to take a walk through the woods, a ritual we called the walk. We loved navigating through the dense forest, using our flashlights to guide us through the darkness. But on this particular night, we decided to venture further into the woods than we ever had before. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow taller and the shadows deeper. We heard strange noises, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but we brushed it off as mere wildlife. But then, we heard the whispering, soft and low. It seemed to come from all around us. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. We tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued our walk, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. We stopped and listened, our hearts racing, and then we saw her, a woman crawling on the ground, her dark clothes blending into the shadows. She was whispering random words, her voice barely audible. We froze, our flashlights fixed on her. She looked up, her eyes locking onto ours, and stood up. "I'm looking for my campsite," she declared, her voice slurred. We exchanged a nervous glance and decided to help her. As we walked her back to the campground, she stumbled and staggered, her words slurring together. We finally found her campsite, but her friends were nowhere to be found. They had left her behind, unaware she was missing. We helped her into her tent, feeling relief and unease. As we walked back to our campsite, we couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The next day we saw her again, sitting by the campfire, her eyes sunken and her skin pale. She barely acknowledged us, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. We tried to avoid her, but she kept appearing, always lurking in the shadows. One night, we decided to take the walk again, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease. But as we walked deeper into the woods, we heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, more urgent. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. And then we saw her, standing before us, her eyes black as coal, her skin gray as the trees. She was whispering, her voice growing louder, more menacing. We tried to run, but our feet felt heavy, as if rooted. She started to move towards us, her eyes fixed on ours, her whispering growing louder. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at our campsite, my friend shaking me awake. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You just collapsed," he replied, his eyes filled with concern. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "We have to leave now." We packed our tents and left the campsite, never looking back. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the whispering woman stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me wonder, what happened in those woods? When I first met Daniel, he seemed like a normal guy. We both needed a roommate to split the rent, and he was polite, clean, and easy to talk to. We moved into a small apartment together, and everything seemed fine. At first, living with Daniel was great. He cooked dinner sometimes, and was always ready to help with chores. We would watch movies together and talk about our days. He worked at a small bookstore downtown, and I had a job at a local coffee shop. Our lives were simple and calm. But then, things started to change. Daniel became more secretive. He would stay out late and sometimes come home with a strange look in his eyes. I would ask him where he had been, and he would shrug and say he had been out with friends. But something felt off. There were nights when I heard him talking on the phone in a calm voice, saying things that didn't make sense. Once, I heard him say they can't find out. It's too risky. One night I came home late from work. The apartment was dark except for a small light coming from Daniel's room. I heard a strange noise, like someone crying. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The crying stopped suddenly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Daniel, are you okay?" I called out. There was a long silence before he replied, "Yeah, just tired. Going to bed now." The next morning, Daniel seemed like his usual self again, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I started noticing other things. There were times when Daniel's clothes had small stains, and he quickly hid them. I found a small knife in the bathroom cabinet with dried blood on it. When I confronted him, he laughed it off, saying he cut himself while cooking. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of dread grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started avoiding Daniel and spending more time at work or out with friends. But even then, I couldn't escape the fear that gripped me whenever I was home. One evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Daniel had gone out, and I knew he wouldn't be back for a few hours. I went into his room and started looking around. I felt guilty invading his privacy, but I needed to know what was going on. I opened his closet and found a box hidden under some clothes. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside the box were newspaper clippings about several unsolved murders in our city. Each article was marked with notes in Daniel's handwriting. There were photos of the victims, details about the crime scenes, and even some small personal items that belonged to them. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands shook as I put everything back and closed the box. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment, not knowing where to go. I ended up at a nearby park, sitting on a bench trying to calm down. I called the police and told them everything I had found. When the police arrived, I showed them the box. They took it seriously and started asking me questions about Daniel. I told them about his strange behavior, the late nights, and the bloodstains. They assured me they would look into it. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with a friend, too scared to go back to the apartment. The police kept in touch, telling me they were watching Daniel. They needed more evidence before they could make an arrest. Finally, one night, I got a call from the police. They had arrested Daniel. He had been caught trying to dispose of another victim's belongings. The police had linked him to several murders through the evidence they found in our apartment. I felt a mix of relief and horror. The person I had been living with, the person I had shared my life with, was a murderer. I went back to the apartment to pack my things. It felt different, darker. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a hidden danger. I couldn't believe I had lived with a killer and hadn't known. As I packed, I found a note in my room. It was from Daniel. "I'm sorry you found out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye." I left the apartment that night, never to return. I moved to a different city, trying to start fresh, but the memories haunted me. Every night, I wondered how I had missed the signs. I wondered how many lives could have been saved if I had noticed sooner. Living with Daniel changed me forever. I became more cautious and more aware of the people around me. I never let anyone get too close. The fear and mistrust stayed with me, a reminder of the dark secret I had lived with, the secret of my roommate, the murderer. I was driving down an empty highway one night. the road stretching out in front of me like a dark ribbon. The only light came from my car's headlights and the pale sliver of the moon hanging in the sky. It was late and I was tired. The radio had lost its signal miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. As I drove, I noticed the gas gauge was dangerously low. I should have filled up at the last town, but I thought I could make it to the next one. Now I wasn't so sure. The needle was hovering just above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Suddenly, the car started to sputter. I pressed down on the gas pedal, but it didn't help. The engine made a choking noise, and then, with a final cough, it died. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my heart sinking. No, 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 I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked, but refused to start. I tried again, but it was no use. I was out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The road was empty, and there were no houses or businesses around. Just trees and darkness. I decided to lock the car and wait inside. Maybe someone would come by, or maybe the signal would return if I waited long enough. I didn't want to leave the car and wander around in the dark. It felt safer inside, with the doors locked. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there was still no signal. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were starting to fray. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head and saw a figure emerging from the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure came closer. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and a scruffy beard. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for a while. He walked up to my car and stopped by the driver's side window. He peered in at me, his eyes wide and wild. Then he started knocking on the window, slowly at first, then harder. The sound echoed in the still night air.
"Hey, let me in,"
he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "I need help." I shook my head, my hands gripping the steering wheel. There was no way I was letting this stranger into my car. "Please," he said, knocking harder. "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. What did he want? Why was he out here in the middle of the night? I felt a chill run down my spine. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw headlights approaching from behind. A car was coming. Relief washed over me. I honked the horn, hoping to get the driver's attention. The approaching car slowed down and came to a stop behind me. It was a police car. 2 officers got out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They walked up to my car, and the man from the woods stepped back, his eyes darting nervously. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, shining his flashlight into my car. I quickly unlocked the door and got out. "My car ran out of gas," I said, my voice shaky. This man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. "I don't know what he wants." The officers turned to the man, who was standing a few feet away, looking anxious. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" one of the officers asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned and started walking back into the woods. The officers watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're lucky we came by," the second officer said. "It's not safe to be out here alone at night. We'll call a tow truck for you and give you a ride to the nearest town." I nodded, grateful and relieved. As I got into the back of the police car, I glanced back at the woods. The man had disappeared into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. That night on the dark highway was something I would never forget. It reminded me how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to be prepared. And it left me with a lingering sense of unease, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I had just turned 30 when I decided to rent a room in a 3-bedroom house. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, seemed eager to lease the space without any background checks. I found that odd, but I needed a place quickly and his rent was cheap. So I moved in without asking too many questions. The house was old but comfortable. There were 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a bathroom that I had to share with my only roommate, Elizabeth. She worked nights, slept during the day, and kept to herself. Although I had lived there for over a month, I had never actually seen her. Our schedules didn't overlap, and she seemed to be very private. From the beginning, strange things started happening. My belongings would be moved. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the dining table. My toothbrush would be wet when I hadn't used it. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but the unease grew. One day, I came home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I walked in cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I double-checked all the windows and doors that night, making sure they were securely locked. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, I would hear footsteps above me, even though Elizabeth was supposed to be at work. Once, I heard a faint humming, like someone singing a lullaby. It was eerie and made my skin crawl. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or my imagination. The turning point came one Friday night. I decided to relax and watch some TV in the living room. I was watching a late-night show, trying to unwind when I felt it. The sensation of being watched. I turned around, but saw nothing. I shook it off and continued watching. Suddenly, the living room light flicked off. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The TV was still on, casting a dim glow across the room. I turned around slowly and saw a shadow in the hallway. It was Elizabeth. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away without a word. "Elizabeth?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I got up, switched the light back on, and hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about her standing there in the dark, watching me. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I packed a small bag and went to a nearby motel. I needed some time away to clear my head. I called Mr. Thompson and told him about the strange occurrences. He seemed concerned, but didn't offer much help. At the motel, I finally got a decent night's sleep. The next day, I returned to the house to gather more of my things. When I walked in, the house felt different, quieter. I quickly went to my room and started packing. As I was leaving, I passed Elizabeth's door. It was slightly open. Curiosity got the better of me. I gently pushed the door open and peered inside. The room was dark, but I could make out a small bed, a dresser, and some old photographs on the wall. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Confused, I stepped inside and took a closer look at the photos. They were of a young woman who looked a lot like Elizabeth. One picture caught my eye. It was of Mr. Thompson, much younger, standing next to the woman. On the back, it was dated 20 years ago. A chill ran down my spine. I realized that the woman in the photo was Elizabeth. But how could that be? She looked the same now as she did back then. I heard a creak behind me and turned around quickly, but no one was there. I grabbed the photo and ran out of the house, my mind racing. I went straight to Mr. Thompson's office. When I showed him the photo, he turned pale. He confessed that Elizabeth was his sister. She had disappeared 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He had kept her room exactly as it was, hoping she would return someday. I felt a mix of fear and sadness. The Elizabeth First had been living with was not his sister, but something else. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I moved out that same day and found a new place to live. I never went back to the old house. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Elizabeth. Who or what was she? I may never know. But one thing is certain, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from home for our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend. We were like, oh, this is gonna be sick. First, we drove down these long pathways to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we just took in all the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the same way, like, I guess they were a part of the camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way, and there was no sign of life. It felt eerie to be at like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves were far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going, ate hot dogs and marshmallows, and spent some time looking at the stars. Then we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was like, "Can we get into the tent now?" so we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and was like, "Shh! Do you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered to her, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling, like low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like words, but hushed and non-elaborated. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. And then silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me, and then we ran to the car. I locked the doors. I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "Okay, I'm gonna grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out. I hopped out and ran, grabbed our ice chest, and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to go get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus, and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes, and I floored it in reverse out of our camping area. Then we came to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get in here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since. I live in a small town in South Texas. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and not much happens. When I was 19, my boyfriend Jack, 2 friends, Amy and Mike, and I decided to go for a late-night drive. We were bored and looking for something exciting to do. It was a warm summer night, and we drove around aimlessly for a while, talking and laughing. At some point, Jack suggested we go to an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It hadn't been used since the 1800s and was known for being creepy. We all thought it was a great idea at the time. Little did we know what we were getting ourselves into. We drove down an old back road that was barely wide enough for Jack's car. The trees on either side were thick and tall, making it even darker. The only light came from the headlights of the car. The further we went, the quieter it got. No more crickets, no more rustling leaves, just the sound of our car tires on the gravel road. It was about 3 a.m. when we finally pulled up to the cemetery. The gate was old and rusty, barely hanging on to its hinges. Jack stopped the car, and we all got out. The air was cool, and a light fog had started to roll in, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As we stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. The cemetery was silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. We walked a few steps in when Amy noticed something in the distance. "What's that?" she whispered, pointing towards the far end of the cemetery. We all squinted, trying to see what she was talking about. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them too. 4 white hooded figures were circling a grave. They moved slowly and deliberately, almost like they were performing some kind of ritual. My heart started to race. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. But no one moved. We were all frozen, staring at the strange figures. Jack, who usually acted brave, looked just as scared as the rest of us. "Yeah, let's get out of here," he finally said. We turned around and hurried back to the car. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As soon as the engine roared to life, he sped off, leaving the cemetery and the hooded figures behind us. The drive back was silent. No one spoke a word. We were all too shaken up by what we had seen. When we finally reached the town, Jack parked the car, and we all just sat there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. "What do you think they were doing?" Amy asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know, and I don't want to know," Mike replied, his voice still shaky. We all agreed that whatever it wasn't something we wanted to stick around to find out. We promised each other that we would never go back to that cemetery and never speak of it again. But the memory stayed with me. Every time I drove past that old back road, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder who those hooded figures were and what they were doing in that old cemetery at 3 a.m. I never thought I'd end up with such a peculiar roommate. It all began innocently enough when I moved into a small apartment in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap and the location was perfect for my job. Little did I know that my new roommate would turn out to be a source of endless unease and terror. His name was Alex, a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes that always seemed to be staring into some unseen void. At first, I brushed off his odd behavior as mere eccentricity. He kept to himself mostly, spending hours locked away in his room. But as the days passed, I started noticing strange things. It started with the whispers. Late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep, I could hear Alex muttering to himself behind closed doors. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was just talking on the phone or watching a strange movie. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if he was engaged in some sinister conversation with an invisible entity. Then came the smells. Foul odors seemed to emanate from Alex's room, like something rotten and decayed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building showing its age. But the stench grew stronger with each passing day until it was impossible to ignore. I confronted Alex about it, but he just laughed it off, claiming he had spilled something and hadn't gotten around to cleaning it up. But it wasn't just the whispers and the smells that unnerved me. It was the way Alex moved like a shadow drifting through the night. He never seemed to sleep, always awake when I stumbled out of bed in the middle of the night for a glass of water. His eyes would follow me, dark and unreadable, sending shivers down my spine. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached Alex's door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my days. Alex was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that cast flickering shadows across the walls. In his hand, he held a book, its pages yellowed with age. But it wasn't the sight of him that froze me in place. It was what he was doing. He was chanting, his voice low and guttural, as if speaking in tongues. I couldn't understand the words, but the air seemed to thrum with dark energy. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, its eyes glowing with malevolence. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I fled from the room. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my bed, where I huddled beneath the covers, praying for the morning to come. But morning brought no relief. If anything, things only got worse. Alex's behavior grew more erratic, his whispers more frenzied. And then, one night, he disappeared altogether. I searched the apartment from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. Weeks passed, and still there was no sign of Alex. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the fear gnawed at me, a constant presence in the back of my mind. And then one night I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere within the walls. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a rat or a mouse, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. And then, one by one, they started to appear. Dark, twisted figures crawled out of the shadows like something out of a nightmare. I watched in horror as they skittered across the floor, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I turned to go, I saw him, Alex, standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and empty. "You can't leave," he said, his voice like ice. "You belong to us now." I fled then, running as fast as my legs would carry me, never looking back. And though I've tried to forget, to put that night behind me, I know that I will never truly escape. The memory of Alex and his strange behavior will haunt me until the end of my days, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our world. It was a night, and the sky was getting darker by the minute. I was driving home with my 2 young children in the back seat. They had been arguing and fussing, and I was at wit's end. I decided to pull over to the side of the road to calm them down and talk to them. I turned on the car's hazard lights and stepped out, opening the back door to look at my kids. "Listen, you two," I said firmly. "You need to stop fighting and be quiet. It's late, and we need to get home safely." I noticed a car pulling up beside us as I was talking to them. The driver rolled down the window, and a middle-aged couple smiled at me. The man leaned out and said, "Hey there, are you okay?" "Yes, we're fine," I replied. "Just had to calm the kids down." The woman in the passenger seat nodded and said, "We wanted to let you know there's been a wreck over the next hill. Traffic is completely stopped. It would help if you took the side road a little way back. It will detour you around the wreck and get you home faster." I thanked them for the advice, and they waved as they drove off. I got back into my car and buckled up, still thinking about what they had said. I didn't know the area too well, and taking a side road in the dark didn't seem like a good idea. I decided to stick to the main road, even if it meant being stuck in traffic for a while. As I drove past the road they mentioned, I glanced over and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The couple's car was parked on the side of the detour road, and they were both standing outside. They weren't moving, they were just standing there, staring into the woods. There was nothing but dense trees all around them. The sight was eerie, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I shook off the feeling and kept driving. I figured they might have stopped for a moment, or maybe they had car trouble. As I crested the hill, I was surprised to see that there was no wreck, no traffic jam, just an empty road ahead. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I drove on. The rest of the drive was uneventful. My kids had finally settled down, and I was grateful to get home and put them to bed. But I couldn't stop thinking about that couple and the strange detour they suggested. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I had to take the same road for some errands. As I approached the detour road, I felt my heartbeat quicken. I slowed down as I got closer, and that's when I saw it. Just past where the couple had parked their car, there was a large sign that read, "Dead End." My mind raced, thinking about how they had stood there, in the dark, with nowhere to go. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Why would they send me down a dead-end road? What were they doing there? And why did they disappear so quickly after talking to me? Years have passed since that night, but I still think about it often. Every time I drive past that detour road, I feel a shiver down my spine. I wonder what would have happened if I had taken their advice and turned down that road. Would I have been stuck in the middle of nowhere? Or worse? One thing is for sure, I'll never forget the chilling sight of that couple standing by their car, surrounded by nothing but dark woods. It still gives me chills to this day, even 15 years later. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I think I see their car out of the corner of my eye. It's always in the same spot, just past the hill before the dead end sign. But when I look directly, there's nothing there. It's as if they're still out there waiting. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm glad I didn't follow their detour. It's a mystery that haunts me, a reminder that not everything is as it seems. I trust my instincts more now, especially when I'm out on those lonely country roads. So if you ever find yourself driving through the countryside and a friendly couple offers you a shortcut, think twice. Sometimes the long way around is the safest home. It was a late Friday night when I finally left the office. The clock on my dashboard showed it was almost midnight. I had been working late all week, and I was exhausted. The regular route home through the city was always busy, even at this hour, so I decided to take a more rural route. It was longer, but much quieter. I thought the peaceful drive might help me unwind after a long day. I turned onto the narrow country road. The moon was full, and the stars were bright. The road was empty, and all I could hear was the hum of my car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was kind of nice, just me and the open road, but soon I started to feel a little uneasy. The night seemed darker, the air colder. After a few miles, I saw the old bridge up ahead. I had crossed it a few times before, but only during the day. At night, it looked different, more eerie. The bridge was made of wood and iron, and it creaked even when no cars were on it. It had been there for many years, long before I was born. As I got closer to the bridge, I noticed a strange red fog rolling in. It was thick and seemed to glow faintly. I had never seen anything like it before. The red fog made the bridge look even scarier. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart started to race. Something about the fog didn't feel right, but I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I drove onto the bridge, and the wooden planks creaked under the weight of my car. The fog grew thicker, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I pressed my foot on the gas pedal, wanting to get across the bridge as quickly as possible. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Finally, I reached the other side of the bridge. I let out a sigh of relief and glanced in my rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. There, standing in the middle of the bridge, was a figure. It looked like a woman in a white dress, her long hair hanging down. She was just standing there staring at my car. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was still there. My mind raced. Who could be out there at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? I felt a surge of fear. I didn't dare stop or turn back. I just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The figure didn't move, just kept standing there in the red fog, watching me drive away. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart still pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow in the fog, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure on the bridge. Over breakfast, I mentioned it to my parents. They exchanged a look, and my dad's face grew serious. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "Who?" I replied, my voice shaking a little. "The girl on the bridge," he said. "There's an old story about that bridge. Many years ago, a young lady hung herself from it. They say her spirit still haunts the place." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What happened to her?" "No one knows for sure," Dad said. "Some say she was waiting for her lover, who never showed up. Others say she was running from something or someone. But everyone agrees on one thing: she died on that bridge, and her spirit never left." I sat there, my breakfast forgotten. The figure in the red fog made sense now, but it also made everything worse. I had seen a ghost, the ghost of a young lady who had taken her own life. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge and the figure in the fog. Sunday night, I barely slept, dreading the drive to work the next morning. When Monday came, I took the city route, even though it was busy and took longer. For weeks, I avoided the rural route and the bridge, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I would dream of the bridge, the red fog, and the figure standing there watching me. Each time, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to look up the story of the bridge. I found old newspaper articles and local legends. The young lady's name was Emily. She was supposed to meet her lover on the bridge one night, but he never came. Heartbroken, she hung herself from the iron railings. People in the area had reported seeing her ghost for years. They described the red fog and the figure in the white dress, just like I had seen. Some said she was looking for her lover, others that she was trying to find peace. Knowing the story didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it harder. I felt sorry for Emily, trapped in her sorrow for eternity. I wondered if there was a way to help her, to let her find peace. One Friday night, a month after I had seen her, I found myself driving the rural route again. I had to know if she was still there. As I approached the bridge, my heart raced, and I felt that familiar chill. The red fog was there, thick and glowing. I drove onto the bridge, and there she was, standing in the middle, just as before. I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "I hope you find peace." For a moment, the figure stood still. Then slowly she started to fade, the red fog lifting. I watched until she disappeared completely, leaving only the quiet night behind. I drove home with a strange sense of calm. I hoped that somehow Emily had found some peace. I never saw her again after that night, but I always remembered her and the old bridge. If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I never liked working late. The silence of the empty office always made me uneasy, but I had no choice. The deadline was tomorrow, and I was way behind on my project. The office, usually bustling with the sounds of ringing phones and people chatting, was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. My name is Tom, and I work as a graphic designer. It was a Friday night, and the office was deserted. Everyone else had left hours ago, excited for the weekend. I watched the last of my colleagues leave, envying their freedom. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer, determined to finish my work. As the hours passed, the light outside my window dimmed until it was pitch black. The only light in the office came from my computer screen and the small desk lamp beside me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I never liked working late. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from sitting in the same position for so long. I walked over to the break room to get a cup of coffee. The hallway was dark, and my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh, cold light. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee was comforting. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a whisper. I paused, straining to listen, but there was nothing. just the hum of the vending machine and the distant sound of the city outside. I shook my head and chuckled nervously. "You're losing it, Tom," I muttered to myself. I finished my coffee and headed back to my desk. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. When I reached my desk, I noticed something strange. My computer screen had gone black. I jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried to turn it back on, but it was completely dead. Frustrated, I checked the power cable and saw that it had been unplugged. I felt a chill run through me. I knew I hadn't unplugged it. My hands trembled as I plugged it back in and turned the computer on. The screen flickered to life, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But my relief was short-lived. A message popped up on the screen: "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to be a prank. Someone was messing with me. But who? Everyone had left hours ago. I looked around the empty office, half expecting to see someone hiding, but there was no one. I decided to ignore the message and get back to work. I was probably just tired and seeing things. I opened my project file and tried to focus, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Minutes passed, and I forced myself to work, but the unease only grew stronger. I kept glancing at the clock, hoping the night would end soon. Suddenly, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound stopped. I took a deep breath and walked towards the hallway, my steps slow and cautious. The corridor was empty, just as it had been before. I decided to check the office one more time, just to be sure. I walked past empty desks and cubicles, my eyes scanning every shadow. As I reached the far end of the office, I noticed something strange. One of the doors to a small conference room was slightly ajar. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Then I heard it again. The whisper. It was close, so close that I could feel the breath on my neck. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide with fear. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was a figure, standing still, watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the figure. The light revealed an old, dusty mannequin, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. I let out a shaky laugh. It was just a mannequin, someone's idea of a joke. I walked over to the door, trying to calm my racing heart. As I reached for the doorknob, the whisper came again. This time, it was unmistakable. "Get out," it said, the voice low and chilling. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The mannequin hadn't moved, but the voice was so close, it was as if it were right next to me. I didn't wait to find out more. I yanked the door open with a burst of strength I didn't know I had and ran down the hallway. I grabbed my bag and sprinted for the exit, not looking back. I burst out of the building and into the cool night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to that office at night again. I finished my project from home, and no deadline was worth the terror I felt that night. To this day, I don't know what I experienced. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe it was something else, something beyond explanation. All I know is that I will never forget the whisper that told me to get out. It was a cold, quiet evening when my family left for their trip. I waved them goodbye, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. I had the whole house to myself for the weekend. I planned to catch up on my favorite TV shows and eat junk food. The thought of being alone didn't scare me at first, but as the night went on, a strange feeling started to creep in. The house was too quiet. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder than usual. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The light from the screen flickered across the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a soft tap. I paused the TV and listened, but the noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it must be the house settling. I turned back to my show, trying to lose myself in the story. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more persistent. It wasn't just a tap, it was a knock. My heart started to race. I got up and walked slowly to the kitchen. I peeked around the corner, but everything looked normal. The doors and windows were all shut. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to go back to the living room. That's when I saw him. A man standing outside the kitchen window, staring right at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. He had a scruffy beard and wore dirty, tattered clothes. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, harder this time. I snapped out of my trance and backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the operator's calm voice asked. "There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. "He's trying to get in." "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way. Can you lock yourself in a room?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, I can." I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I sat on the floor, back against the door, trying to keep calm. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that the police were on their way. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The man had broken the window. He was inside the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, getting closer and closer. "He's in the house," I whispered to the operator, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet and stay where you are," she replied. "The police are almost there." I heard him trying the doors, one by one. When he reached my bedroom door, he started banging on it, trying to break it down. I pushed harder against the door, praying it would hold. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The banging got louder and more desperate. Just when I thought the door would give in, I heard sirens in the distance. The man must have heard them too, because the banging stopped. Everything went silent. I listened carefully. Then I heard the sound of running footsteps, followed by the front door slamming shut. He was trying to escape. Moments later, I heard voices downstairs. The police had arrived. "It's okay, the police are here," the operator said. "You can open the door now." I slowly unlocked the door and stepped out. My legs were shaking so badly, I could barely stand. I made my way downstairs, where 2 police officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice trembling. "We got him," the other officer said. "He's in custody now. You're safe." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents returned, making sure I was safe and secure. I told them everything that had happened, and they assured me that the man would be taken care of. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at the window. But I was grateful that it was over, and that I was safe. The police told us later that the man was a drifter with a history of breaking. He had been caught several times, but always managed to escape. This time they promised he wouldn't get away. From that night on, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight before I went to bed. I also got an alarm system installed. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me to be more careful. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was 12 years old the first time I stayed home alone at night. My parents were going to a dinner party, and they promised to be back by 10. I was excited at first. Finally, a night of freedom. I could eat as much ice cream as I wanted and watch scary movies until I fell asleep. It was going to be great. The night started well. I had my favorite ice cream flavor, chocolate chip cookie dough, and my favorite blanket wrapped around me. I decided to watch a movie I had seen a dozen times before, but it always scared me just the right amount. It was about a haunted house, and even though I knew every twist and turn, it still made my heart race. It was around 9 o'clock when I first heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone was walking around up there. I paused the movie and listened intently. The house was silent. Maybe it was just the old house settling, I told myself. I had heard my parents say that 100 times before. Trying to shake off the unease, I resumed my movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. The wind outside howled, making the tree branches scrape against the windows like long, bony fingers. The sound was eerie, but I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind. Then I heard the noise again, louder this time. It was coming from upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom, "Are you guys almost home?" I waited, but there was no reply. I checked the time. It was only 9:15. They wouldn't be home for at least another 45 minutes. I decided to be brave. I stood up, clutching my blanket like a shield, and crept towards the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and I winced at every sound. I reached the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. I took a deep breath and started checking each room. The first room I checked was my parents' bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. It was dark, but everything looked normal. Next, I checked my room. Again, nothing unusual. I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe it was just the house settling. I was about to go back downstairs when I heard it again. This time, the sound was coming from the attic. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down my spine. I had always been scared of the attic. It was dark and full of old, creepy things my parents had collected over the years. I never went up there, but tonight, something was different. I felt like I had to check it out. I slowly approached the attic door, my heart pounding louder than ever. I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the noise again, clear and unmistakable. It was a faint, shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving up there. I took a deep breath and started climbing the stairs. They creaked loudly with each step, and I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. When I reached the top, I saw the attic was even darker than I remembered. I fumbled for the light switch and finally found it. The light flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I looked around, my eyes scanning the room. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs filled every corner. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something strange. One of the old trunks was slightly open. I knew it had always been closed before. I walked over to the trunk, my hands trembling. I reached out and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but old clothes and a few books. I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. This time it was right behind me. I spun around and my heart almost stopped. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was this thing? How did it get into my house? I took another step back, and the figure moved closer. I could hear my heartbeat, loud and frantic. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was low and cold. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is my home now." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I flew down the attic stairs, almost tripping in my haste. I ran down the hall and back down the main staircase. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I called my parents, my hands shaking so much I could barely dial. When they finally answered, I told them everything. They rushed home and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire house, including the attic. They found nothing. No sign of the figure I had seen. They told my parents it was probably my imagination, that maybe I had watched one too many scary movies. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I never felt safe in that house again, especially when I was alone, because I knew, somewhere in the shadows, that figure was still there, watching, waiting. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night where the wind howled like a ghost and the rain poured down in sheets, making it hard to see the road ahead. I was sitting in the back seat of our old, reliable car, and my mom was driving. We were on our way back home from visiting Grandma. The trip was long and I was tired. My eyes felt heavy, and I could feel myself drifting off to sleep. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt, jerking me awake. I was thrown forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest. I looked up and saw a man standing in the middle of the road. He was drenched from the rain and his clothes were tattered and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were wild and frantic, like a cornered animal. My mom gasped and quickly locked the doors. She kept her foot on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but something about him felt wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. Before we could react, 3 more men emerged from the shadows. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, like ghosts in the night. They surrounded the car, banging on the windows and pulling at the door handles. My mom screamed, and I could see the terror in her eyes. "Lock your doors," she shouted. "Keep them locked." I did as she said, fumbling with a lock on my door. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. The men were shouting, their voices muffled by the rain and the closed windows. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. One of the men had a crowbar, and he started hitting the driver's side window with it. The glass held firm, but I could see small cracks forming. My mom's eyes were wide with fear, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm gonna get us out of here." She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar jumped back just in time, avoiding the car by inches. The other men scattered, shouting angrily as we sped down the road. The car skidded and swerved on the wet pavement, but my mom kept it under control. She drove as fast as she could, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I looked back and saw the men growing smaller and smaller in the distance. My heart was still pounding, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "Are you okay?" my mom asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but I didn't trust myself to speak. I was too scared. My mom reached back and squeezed my hand, her grip reassuring but still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay, we're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound of the rain beating against the car and the hum of the engine. My mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we neared our neighborhood, the rain began to let up, and the storm started to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of streetlights ahead. I started to relax a little, feeling the tension in my body begin to ease. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my mom parked the car and turned off the engine. She took a deep breath and looked at me. "Always lock your doors," she said. "No matter where you are or how safe you think it is. Always lock your doors." I nodded again, understanding the importance of her words. That night had been a terrifying reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. It was a lesson neither of us would ever forget. As we walked into the house, my mom wrapped her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a comforting blanket, wrapping us in its embrace. We were safe, and that was all that mattered. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory lingered. It was a sobering reminder to always be cautious, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock our doors. It was a lesson that had been learned the hard way, but one that would keep us safe in the future. My name is Sarah, and I live alone in a small house on the edge of town. It's a cozy place, surrounded by tall trees that sway gently in the wind. I've always loved the quiet, but lately, something strange has been happening. It started with small things. My food would disappear, or I'd find the kitchen window open when I was sure I had closed it. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft noise above me. It sounded like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the attic floor. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a raccoon. But the next morning, I found more signs. An empty can of beans on the kitchen counter that I hadn't opened, crumbs on the floor, and the attic door slightly ajar. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the attic stairs. The air was musty, and dust particles danced in the beam of light. As I reached the top, I saw a small bed made of old blankets and a few empty cans of food. Someone had been living up here. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Who could it be? And why my house? I stayed awake that night, waiting and listening. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. I tiptoed to the kitchen and waited in the dark. Moments later, the figure of a man emerged from the attic. He was thin, with ragged clothes and a tired look in his eyes. He froze when he saw me. "Please don't call the police," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go." I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Something inside me softened. Instead of feeling scared, I felt a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not going to call the police," I replied, "but you need to tell me why you're here." His name was Jack. He had lost his job and home a few months ago and had been wandering the streets ever since. He found my attic one cold night and had been sneaking in for food and shelter. I thought about what to do. I couldn't let him keep living in the attic, but I also couldn't just turn him away. I decided to help him. I offered him a hot meal, and as we sat at the kitchen table, we talked. Jack told me about his life, his dreams, and how everything had fallen apart. I listened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a connection with someone. The next day, I took Jack to a local shelter and helped him get in touch with some social services. We started working on his resume, and I reached out to some friends who might have job leads. Jack was grateful, and I could see him starting to hope again. Days turned into weeks, and Jack and I developed a routine. He would come by for meals, and we would work on job applications and practice interview skills. Slowly but surely, he started to regain his confidence. One evening, after he had left for the shelter, I realized how much my life had changed since he came into it. I no longer felt lonely. Jack had become a friend, someone I cared about deeply. One day, Jack came to my house with great news. He had landed a job at a local store. We celebrated with a homemade dinner, and I could see the pride in his eyes. He thanked me for believing in him when no one else did. I told him he deserved it and that I was proud of him. With his new job, Jack found a small apartment. He moved out of the shelter, and our visits became less frequent as he got busier. But we stayed in touch. He would come over for dinner once a week, and we'd catch up on each other's lives. Months passed, and Jack's life continued to improve. He got promoted at work, made new friends, and even started volunteering at the shelter where he once stayed. Seeing him grow and succeed filled my heart with joy. One evening, Jack invited me to his new apartment for dinner. As I walked in, I saw a framed photo on his wall of the two of us from one of our dinners. He smiled and said, "You changed my life, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without you." Tears filled my eyes as I hugged him. "You changed mine too, Jack," I replied. "You reminded me of the power of kindness and how important it is to help each other." From that day on, Jack and I remained close friends. Our bond, born from a scary and uncertain situation, had turned into something beautiful. I learned that sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the most heartwarming outcomes, and that compassion and generosity can truly change lives. And so, my little house on the edge of town no longer felt empty. It was filled with memories of a friendship that had grown from the unlikeliest of places. And every time I heard the gentle creak of the attic, I smiled, remembering how it all began. I arrived at the rundown motel on Watt Avenue in Sacramento late one evening, tired from a long day on the road. The motel looked as shabby as the online reviews had warned, but it was cheap, and I was too exhausted to care. I checked in, got my room key, and dragged my heavy suitcase to room 12, hoping for a few hours of rest. The room was even worse than I had imagined. The wallpaper peeled off the walls, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The bed, with its lumpy mattress and threadbare sheets, didn't look inviting at all. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the springs creak beneath me. As I sat there, I felt an itch on my arm. I scratched it, but then felt another itch on my leg. Looking closer, I saw tiny, reddish-brown bugs crawling on the bedspread. Bed bugs, just my luck. There was no way I could sleep on that bed now. I looked around the room for an alternative and noticed the small, grimy bathroom. The bathtub, while not exactly clean, seemed like a better option than the bug-infested bed. I grabbed a spare blanket from my suitcase and laid it out in the tub. It was hard and uncomfortable, but at least I wouldn't be eaten alive by bugs. I lay down in the tub, pulling my jacket over me for warmth. The hard surface made it difficult to fall asleep, but exhaustion eventually took over, and I drifted into a restless slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. At first, I couldn't figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the main room. My heart started to pound in my chest. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just the wind or a stray animal. But then I heard a louder noise, like someone bumping into a piece of furniture. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in my room. I quietly reached for my pocket knife, the only weapon I had. My hands shook as I unfolded the blade, gripping it tightly. I slowly climbed out of the tub, careful not to make a sound, and crept towards the door, peeking through the small crack. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw a shadow moving near my suitcase. My blood ran cold. An intruder was rummaging through my belongings. I had to do something, but I was terrified. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure froze and turned to face me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a scruffy beard and wild eyes. He looked as startled as I felt. We stood there, staring at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, the man broke the silence. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice shaky. "I thought this room was empty." I tightened my grip on the knife. "What are you doing in here?" I asked, my voice trembling. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry. I was just looking for a place to sleep. I saw the window was unlocked and figured I could crash here for the night. I didn't know anyone was staying here." My mind raced. He didn't seem dangerous, but I couldn't be sure. "You need to leave," I said firmly, hoping he wouldn't notice how scared I was. The man nodded slowly. Okay, I'll go. I didn't take anything, I swear." He took a step towards the door, but then paused, looking back at me. "You should lock your window. It's not safe around here." I watched him warily as he walked to the door and slipped out into the night. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small sense of relief. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to calm down. The reality of what had just happened slowly sank in. I had been seconds away from a potentially dangerous confrontation, and yet somehow it had ended without violence. Looking around the dingy room, I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, checking the room to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. The itch on my arm reminded me of the bed bugs, and I shuddered at the thought. As I left the motel, I made sure to double-check the lock on my car door. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and I decided to drive to a nearby diner. I needed a strong cup of coffee and some time to gather my thoughts. Sitting in the diner, surrounded by the comforting hum of early morning chatter, I reflected on the night's events. It had been a terrifying experience, but I had made it through. I couldn't shake the intruder's final words from my mind. This place wasn't safe. I knew one thing for sure. I would be a lot more careful about where I chose to stay in the future. And I would always lock my window. When I was young, my parents bought a big old house in the middle of nowhere. They said it was a great deal. We moved in, excited about the fresh start. Little did we know, the house had a dark history. A history that would change our lives forever. The house was beautiful, in a way. Tall and proud, it stood alone with trees around it. It had big windows and a wide porch, but something about it felt off. The air was always cold, even in summer. Strange noises echoed at night. Sometimes I heard whispers when I was alone. I thought it was my imagination. My parents seemed happy at first. They worked hard to make the house a home. Dad painted the walls bright colors. Mom filled the rooms with flowers. They laughed and sang as they worked. But soon the laughter faded. The house seemed to drain their joy. They started arguing over small things. Dad's health began to decline, though the doctors found nothing wrong. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I got up and saw my mom standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness. Her eyes were empty, like she was in a trance. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Then she turned and walked back to her room. The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. Things got worse. Dad became more and more ill. He was in pain all the time and couldn't work. Mom looked tired and sad. She started having strange dreams and couldn't sleep. I tried to help, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. One evening, I found an old book in the attic. It was covered in dust, its pages yellowed with age. The book tells the story of the house. It had been built over 100 years ago by a man named Jonathan Crane. Jonathan was a rich but cruel man. He mistreated everyone, even his own family. His wife, Mary, was found dead in the house, and people said he had cursed her. After that, every family who lived there faced tragedy. There were fires, accidents, and unexplained deaths. I showed the book to my mom, but she didn't believe in curses. She said it was just an old story. She tried to burn the book, but it wouldn't catch fire. That night, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the walls shook. It was like the house was angry. Dad died shortly after that night. His death was sudden and unexplained. The doctors were baffled. Mom was devastated. She couldn't cope and soon fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and finally, she too passed away. I was left alone in the house, feeling its cold grip around me. I moved away as soon as I could, but the house stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I kept thinking about its dark history and the families it had destroyed. I knew it wasn't over. The curse would continue with the next owners. Years passed, and new people bought the house. I hoped they would fare better, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't. The house's curse was too strong. Tragic stories followed. A young couple moved in, full of hope. They lost their child in a freak accident. A single man moved in next. He disappeared without a trace. I felt helpless. No matter how many times people tried to cleanse the house, the cycle of misfortune continued. Priests, shamans, and even modern paranormal investigators tried to break the curse, but nothing worked. The house remained a place of sorrow. Now, as an adult, I often drive by the old house. It still stands tall and proud, but I can see the sadness on its walls. I think about the families that have suffered there, including my own. I think about the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and I feel a burning desire to end it. I want to destroy the house, burn it to the ground, and end its legacy of sorrow. But I'm scared. What if the curse is too strong? What if destroying the house only makes things worse? I don't know what to do. I watch as a new family moves in. They seem happy and full of dreams. I hope they fare better, but deep down, I fear for them. I fear the house will claim them too, just like it did my parents and so many others. The cycle of misfortune seems unbreakable, but maybe, just maybe, there is a way to end it. I don't know how, but I have to try. I can't let the house continue to destroy lives. I owe it to my parents and to all the families who have suffered to find a way to break the curse. One day, I gather my courage and drive to the house. I stand in front of it, feeling its cold, dark presence. I take a deep breath and walk up the steps. The door creaks open and I step inside. The air is heavy, filled with sadness and anger. I can hear the whispers and feel the house watching me. I don't know what I will do, but I have to try. I have to end the curse once and for all. For my parents, for all the victims, and for the new family that now calls this house their home. The house has taken so much, but it won't take any more. Not if I can help it. I took the night shift job as a security guard because I needed the money. It wasn't my first choice, but it paid well, and I thought it would be an easy job. My name is John, and this is the story of the scariest night of my life. The building I worked in was old and big. It used to be a factory, but now it was empty. My job was to walk around and make sure everything was okay. Every hour, I had to check all the rooms and write down that nothing was wrong. I started my shift at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m. The first few nights were quiet. I brought a book to read and drank coffee to stay awake. I liked the silence. It gave me time to think, but on the fourth night, things changed. It started like any other night. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. and took over from the day guard, Bill. Bill was an old man who had worked there for years. He warned me about the noises. "This place is old," he said. "It creaks and groans. Don't let it scare you." I laughed and told him I wasn't afraid of a few noises. At 10 p.m. I began my first round. The building was dark and my flashlight made long shadows on the walls. I walked through the rooms, checking doors and windows. Everything was fine. At 11 p.m. I started my second round. This time I heard something. It was a soft whispering sound. I stopped and listened. The whispering stopped too. I shook my head and told myself it was just the wind. At midnight, I was in the basement. The basement was the creepiest part of the building. It was cold and damp, and it smelled like mold. I was about to leave when I heard the whispering again. This time it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no answer. I shone my flashlight into the corner, but there was nothing there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly finished my check and went back upstairs. At 1 a.m. I was back in the main hall. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just my imagination. I tried to focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At 2 a.m. I decided to take a break. I went to the security office and sat down. The office was small, with a desk, a chair, and a few monitors showing different parts of the building. I watched the monitors, hoping to see something that would explain the noises. But everything looked normal. At 3 a.m., I had to do my next round. I was nervous, but I forced myself to go. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The whispering started again, louder and clearer. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't understand the words. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and turned around quickly. Again, there was nothing there. I hurried through my check and went back to the office. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I needed the job. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just an old building making noises. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. At 4 a.m., I saw something on the monitors. In one of the rooms, there was a figure. It was tall and dark, and it didn't move. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the room. When I got there, it was empty. I searched the room, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the office, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what I saw. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the monitors again, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. At 5 a.m. I was exhausted. I just wanted the night to end. I decided to do one last round. As I walked through the building, I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I reached the basement again. The whispering was louder than ever. It sounded like it was all around me. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around. There was no one there. I ran out of the basement and didn't stop until I reached the office. At 6 a.m., Bill arrived to take over. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. He nodded and said, "You're not the first. This place is haunted. They say a worker died here years ago and never left." I quit that morning. I couldn't handle another night in that building. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes I hear the whispering in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I'll never forget my time as a night shift security guard. It was a chilly evening when I found myself lost in the dark, dense forest. I had wandered away from my campsite to collect some firewood, but the trees all looked the same, and soon I couldn't tell which way I'd come. The sun had set, and the forest grew darker with every passing minute. My flashlight flickered, barely piercing through the shadows. I was all alone, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path I took seemed wrong. Panic began to creep in. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the thought of spending the night alone in the woods was terrifying. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a familiar landmark or some sign of my campsite. As I walked, I heard the snap of a twig behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. "It's just an animal," I told myself, trying to stay calm. I continued walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every rustle of leaves and every sound of the wind seemed to be amplified in the silence of the night. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing among the trees. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. I took a step back, my heart racing. The figure took a step forward. That's when I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Someone or something was out there. Fear took over and I started to run. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from that figure. The forest was a maze, and every direction looked the same. I stumbled over roots and branches, the trees seeming to close in around me. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate. They were getting closer. I ran harder, my breath coming in gasps. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, relentless, never slowing down. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw a dim light in the distance. Hope surged through me, and I pushed myself towards it. The light was coming from an old cabin, half hidden by the trees. I dashed to the door and banged on it with all my strength. "Help! Please, someone help me!" I shouted. The door creaked open, and an old man stood there, his face lined with age but his eyes sharp and alert. "Come in, quickly," he said, pulling me inside and slamming the door shut. I collapsed onto the floor, panting and trying to catch my breath. The old man locked the door and turned to me. "What happened? Why are you out here?" I told him everything, about how I had gotten lost and the shadowy figure that had chased me. The old man listened carefully, nodding. "You did well to find this cabin," he said. "Not many do." He helped me to a chair and gave me a cup of hot tea. The warmth seeped into my bones and I started to feel a bit safer. The old man introduced himself as Henry. He had lived in the forest for many years and knew its dangers well. "You're lucky you found this place," Henry said. "There are things in these woods that you don't want to meet in the dark." I shivered. not wanting to think about what might have happened if I hadn't found the cabin. Henry was kind and reassuring, and he promised to help me find my way back to my campsite in the morning. "You need to rest now," he said. "You'll be safe here for the night." Despite the fear and exhaustion, I managed to fall asleep in the old cabin. The fire crackled warmly, and for the first time since I had gotten lost, I felt a sense of peace. The next morning, Henry and I set out to find my campsite. The forest seemed less intimidating in the daylight, but I still stayed close to Henry, trusting his knowledge of the woods. He moved with confidence, guiding us through the trees. After what felt like hours, we finally arrived at my campsite. I was overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Henry," I said, feeling tears of relief welling up in my eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Henry smiled kindly. "Just be careful next time," he said. "The forest can be a dangerous place, especially at night." As I watched Henry disappear back into the woods, I realized how lucky I had been. I gathered my things, packed up my campsite, and made my way home, vowing never to wander too far into the forest alone again. The memory of that shadowy figure still haunts me, but I'll always be grateful to Henry for saving me that night. The forest is beautiful, but it's also a place of mystery and danger, and it's important to respect that. I've always been curious about the dark web. I've heard stories about it, a place where you can find anything, no rules, no limits. It sounded dangerous and thrilling. One night, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to explore it. I thought I was prepared. I was so wrong. I sat in my dimly lit room, the only light coming from my computer screen. I had done some research and learned that I needed a special browser to access the dark web. It was called Tor. I downloaded it and installed it on my computer. My heart was pounding with excitement and fear. After opening Tor, I found a search engine that could help me navigate this hidden part of the internet. It was called the Hidden Wiki. I clicked on the link and a list of websites appeared. Most of them had strange, random names that didn't make any sense. Some promised illegal services, others claimed to sell things you couldn't find anywhere else. I knew I should be careful. I didn't want to do anything illegal. I was just curious. I clicked on a link that said Darknet Markets. It took me to a forum where people were talking about different marketplaces on the dark web. They were discussing drugs, weapons, fake IDs, and other illegal stuff. It was scary to read, but also fascinating. Then I saw a link that caught my eye. It said Red Room. I had heard of these before. They were supposed to be live streams where people were hurt, or worse, for the entertainment of others. I didn't believe they were real. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But my curiosity was too strong. I clicked the link. A new page opened. It was black with red text. It said, "Enter at your own risk." My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop now. I clicked enter. The screen went black for a moment, then a video player appeared. There was a countdown timer showing 5 minutes. I guessed it was a countdown to the start of the stream. I sat there, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to close the browser and forget about all this, but another part of me wanted to see what would happen. The countdown reached 0. The video player flickered to life. At first, the screen was dark. Then a dim light came on. I could see a room. It looked like a basement. The walls were bare concrete, and there was a single chair in the middle of the room. A person was sitting in the chair, tied up. They had a bag over their head. I felt a chill run down my spine. This couldn't be real. It had to be fake. I wanted to believe it was fake, but it looked so real. Suddenly, another figure appeared on the screen. This person was wearing a black mask and gloves. They walked over to the person in the chair and pulled the bag off their head. It was a woman. She looked terrified. She started to scream, but her screams were muffled. I realized she had a gag in her mouth. I felt sick. This was too much. I reached for my mouse to close the browser, but the screen went black again, and a message appeared. It said, "You cannot leave now." My heart skipped a beat. How could they know I wanted to leave? The masked person on the screen looked directly at the camera. It felt like they were looking right at me. Then they spoke. Their voice was distorted, making it sound unnatural. "Welcome, viewer," they said. "You wanted to see the dark web. Now you are part of it." I tried to close the browser again, but my computer wasn't responding. I pressed the power button, hoping to shut it down. Nothing happened. Panic started to set in. The masked person on the screen continued to talk. "You cannot escape. We know who you are. We know where you are." Tears filled my eyes. This was a nightmare. I tried to pull the plug from my computer, but it was stuck. The masked figure laughed. "We have control now. You should never have come here." I looked back at the screen. The woman in the chair was crying. The masked person moved closer to her, holding a knife. I couldn't watch it. I turned away, but I could still hear her muffled screams. Then my phone buzzed. I jumped, almost dropping it. I looked at the screen. There was a new message from an unknown number. It said, "Watch, or it gets worse." My hands were shaking so much, I could barely hold the phone. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. I looked back at the screen, tears streaming down my face. The masked person was still there, standing over the woman. They hadn't hurt her yet, but I knew they would. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I told them what was happening. They didn't believe me at first, but then I gave them my address and begged them to come quickly. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. The video stream continued, but the masked person hadn't done anything yet. It was like they were waiting, watching me, enjoying my fear. Finally, I heard sirens outside. Relief washed over me. The police were here. They would help. I heard a loud knock on the door. I ran to open it, sobbing. The police officers looked at me with concern. I tried to explain what had happened, but it was hard to find the words. They came inside and looked at my computer. The screen was still showing the live stream. One of the officers took a look at it and then turned to me. "We need to take your computer as evidence," he said. "We'll do everything we can to track these people down." I nodded, too shaken to speak. They took my computer and left. I was alone in my room, feeling more scared than I ever had in my life. I knew I would never forget what I had seen. I wished I had never tried to access the dark web. Curiosity had led me into a nightmare. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I have always loved camping alone in the wilderness. There was something magical about the peace, away from the busy city. Last weekend, I decided to spend a night in my SUV, deep in the forest. The air was fresh and the stars shone brightly above. I parked my car in a small clearing and set up my little camp. As the sun went down, I made a small fire and cooked a simple dinner. The woods were alive with sounds. I could hear crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was soothing and I felt at peace. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and enjoying the solitude. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. I put out the fire and climbed into my SUV. The back was set up like a small bedroom with a sleeping bag of pillows. It was cozy and I felt safe inside. I cracked the windows slightly to let in some fresh air and lay down, ready to sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something strange. It was faint at first, but it sounded like chanting. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears to listen. The chanting was eerie, like a distant song carried by the wind. It sent shivers down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some animals making noises, but the chanting grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the woods, not too far away. I sat up and peered out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The trees cast long shadows, and the only light came from the moon. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I had never heard anything like this before. I debated whether I should stay or drive away. But then, as suddenly as it started, the chanting stopped. The forest was silent again. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just some locals having a strange ritual, I thought. I decided to stay. I locked the doors and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept, but I was startled awake by a loud knocking on the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up quickly. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a face peering in at me. It was a man with wild eyes and a disheveled appearance. Panic surged through me. I let out a guttural scream, a sound I didn't even know I could make. The man outside jumped back, startled by my reaction. He turned and ran into the darkness of the forest. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to turn on the car's lights. The clearing was empty, but the fear lingered. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the car lights on and my eyes glued to the windows, watching for any sign of movement. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I wished for the dawn to come quickly. Finally, the first light of morning broke through the trees. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I decided it was time to leave this place. I started the car and drove away, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of that man's face from my mind. Who was he? Why was he out here in the middle of the night? And what was that eerie chanting? Questions swirled in my head, but I had no answers. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner. I needed to gather my thoughts and have a hot meal. The waitress noticed my shaken state and asked if I was okay. I told her about my experience, hoping for some explanation. She listened intently, her expression growing serious. "You're not the first person to talk about strange happenings in those woods," she said. "There are old stories about the place being haunted. People say they've seen strange figures and heard chanting at night." Her words sent another chill down my spine. I finished my meal quickly and thanked her. As I got back into my car, I realized that I might never know what happened that night. But one thing was clear: I wouldn't be camping alone in those woods again. The experience left me shaken but unharmed. I learned to respect the unknown and to listen to my instincts. Sometimes the wilderness holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. And sometimes it's better to find peace in the safety of familiar places rather than the heart of the unknown. When I wasn't living in New York City, I used to travel quite a bit by car. I found myself in this little town in Delaware called Milford. I had plans down there not too far in a place called Rehoboth Beach, which I think was like 45 minutes or an hour away. I was supposed to leave the day after I left, but to avoid getting up early in the morning and leaving, I ended up leaving after work, which was approximately 6 p.m., and taking the drive that night, which lasted about 5 hours, and changed. Since I was only staying here for an extremely short amount of time, I got myself a motel, which I use all the time when I travel, so I'm pretty comfortable with it. I messaged the guy right before I left if I could rent his $50 little place that seemed pretty nice from the photos. The guy from the get-go was a little sketchy, and it took me some back and forth to get the place rented that night after he informed me his father would have dropped the key off. He also informed me there would be quite a bit of tropical plants in the kitchen, and he couldn't move them out on such short notice. Okay, whatever, I'm just looking for a few hours sleep, then I'm out of there in the morning. So I get there around 11:30 p.m. Not sure how many of you are from/have been to Milford, but it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. This guy's place was in a tiny little gated community, which had a total of 15 to 20 houses maybe. Pitch black, so I roll up to the place and grab the few items I always travel with: a duffel bag, backpack, jacket, and extra jacket. Use the key code to unlock the lockbox and turn the key, which happens to be the loudest thing that's happening in the surrounding area at the moment. You know when you go to a place where you know some stuff is messed up and you get that gut feeling that maybe you shouldn't be there? Yay, same feeling. So I put my stuff down on the recliner in front of me, and yes, lo and behold, a lot of tropical plants in the kitchen. I look around this place, which has a pretty decent living room. Bedroom number 1, dolls from like the 50s everywhere. Twin-sized mattresses with no bed frame and no sheets lay in the middle of the floor. Okay, yeah, forget that room. Go to the next room. Nutcracker figures everywhere, one sheet on the bed, no pillows. Try to turn the light on with the only switch in the room. Oh wait, there is no light in the room at all. The switch goes to nothing. All right, forget this room too. I'll take the couch. At this point, I felt pretty uncomfortable, but I knew it was only for the night. Anyway, I was hungry, so I went to the only thing around that was open, a Food Lion that was closing in like 15 minutes. I grabbed some pizza bites and a peach Snapple, classy, right? And went back home. Side note, I was so off-put by this feeling, I set my GoPro I travel with up while I was gone. So I get back to this place, and the first thing I do is look around to make sure everything is in place just where I left it. That's a good sign. I get my GoPro, take the SD out, and pop the card in my laptop. I still have the footage somewhere. I wish you guys could have seen this place. It looked like where you would spend your last seconds. Lo and behold, nothing on the footage. At this time, it was well past midnight, and I had a full day of work and a good amount due driving, so I planned to sleep on the very small couch. The apartment had one small 19-inch TV, which didn't have a power cable, and the outlet by the couch was just far enough away where my phone wouldn't reach while charging. This wouldn't have mattered anyway because I had Sprint at the time, and they have poor service to begin with. But where I was, no service. I kept the light on because even though I'm an adult, it gave me some comfort knowing the light was on. Well, about an hour of laying there, I couldn't sleep, so nature called and I had to use the bathroom, so I got up and sat down in the neon yellow, dimly lit bathroom with the shower that had no curtain. Now, let me preface all of this by saying the kitchen had hardwood floors, the type where if you slide a chair across it, it makes that screeching noise that we're all familiar with. Remember that part will play a role soon. Back to it, I'm in the bathroom doing my business, reading a bottle on the John because my phone is charging outside of the bathroom because how convenient, which didn't matter anyway. After all, like I mentioned, I didn't have service. So I'm sitting there and I hear the chair on the faux hardwood floor screeching across the floor, being pulled across the floor, gently, for about as long as it takes for someone to sit down. I almost threw my heart up. This was a come to Jesus, I messed up moment. And then just as I thought it couldn't get any worse, the sound of fingers rhythmically tapping on top of the wooden kitchen table, impatiently getting faster. Frozen, astounded. Good thing I was already on the toilet. I say there and repeated to myself 10, 11 times, I'm messed up, I'm messed up, I'm messed up. So I sat there for 2 to 3 minutes and debated what to do. At this point, the tapping had stopped, but I figured that I couldn't stay in there forever. I thought to myself, whoever is out there already knows I'm here. So I decided to forget it. I'm gonna go there and try to fight him off and grab the Bowie knife I carry in my backpack when I travel. And basically try to defend myself because I assume they don't want to play checkers or talk about their day of killing with me. So I rush out of the door and nothing. Nobody there, no sign of anybody. The chairs were not even moved. Did not even bother to check the rest of the place. Packed my stuff up as if the place was burning down, got in my car and drove to my Holiday Inn an hour away at like 3 a.m. and told the guy at the desk what happened, and he let me check into my room that was for like 3 p.m. the next day, to a king-sized bedroom because the room that was reserved for me wasn't even ready. When I was a solo driver, I was making a delivery in Memphis, TN. It was a hot summer evening, and the sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow over the streets. I had been driving for hours, and my GPS led me to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a sense of unease settling in. The building seemed abandoned, and the only sound was the creaking of old wooden crates in the wind. I grabbed my clipboard and stepped out of the truck, feeling the warm air envelop me. The receiver, a gruff-looking man with a thick beard, met me at the loading dock. He signed for the delivery, and I began to unload the cargo. But as the hours ticked by, he kept me waiting, claiming there was an issue with the paperwork. As the clock struck 7, my driving time was up. I needed to find a place to park for my mandatory 10-hour reset. The receiver suggested I head to the nearby TA Petro truck stop in West Memphis, just across the state line. I thanked him and climbed back into my rig, feeling frustrated and tired. The drive to the truck stop was uneventful, but as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed it was eerily quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I parked in the very back, where the darkness seemed to swallow my truck whole. My dog, Noodles, a scruffy little terrier, whined in the passenger seat, sensing my unease. I took Noodles out for a quick walk, and as we strolled through the deserted lot, I noticed a man standing behind a trailer, just staring into space. His presence sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickened my pace, hurrying Noodles back to the safety of the truck. After settling Noodles in, I grabbed my dinner bag and headed to the truck stop's restaurant. As I walked, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned to see the same man from the trailer following me at a distance. My heart raced, and I picked up my pace, weaving through the parked trucks. But no matter how many turns I took, he kept pace with me, always lurking just out of sight. I pushed open the door to the restaurant, grateful for the warm glow and bustling atmosphere inside. The place was packed, and I slid onto a stool at the bar, ordering a burger and fries. As I waited for my food, I glanced around, searching for the mysterious man, but he was nowhere to be seen. Halfway through my meal, nature called, and I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned, my fork was on the right side of my plate. I'm left-handed, and I always place my utensils on the left. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had touched my food. I called the waitress over, still standing behind my chair, and asked if she had messed with my meal. She denied it, and I asked if she'd seen anyone else near my plate. She shook her head, too busy to notice anything. I requested the manager, and when he arrived, I told him about the strange man and my tampered food. But the manager's expression turned serious, and he offered to replace my meal and move me to a safer seat. As I waited for my new food to arrive, he disappeared into the office and returned with a stern look. I reviewed the camera feed, he said, and a man did indeed approach your plate while you were in the restroom. He added something to your mashed potatoes, stirred it, and left the building. My skin crawled. The manager offered to call the police, and I agreed, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. As I finished my new meal, the manager sat down across from me, his eyes scanning the restaurant. "I don't want you to leave alone," he said. "The police will escort you to your truck." Before long, 2 officers arrived, taking statements and searching the premises. They found no sign of the mysterious man, but promised to keep an eye on the truck stop. One of the officers offered to drive me back to my rig, and as we walked through the dark lot, I felt a sense of gratitude toward these kind strangers. As we reached my truck, the officer told me his partner would keep watch over the lot all night, ensuring my safety. I thanked them both, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The night had been long and terrifying, but thanks to the kindness of strangers, I made it through unscathed. As I settled in for the night, Noodles curled up beside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious man was still out there, watching and waiting. But with the police keeping watch, I felt a sense of security, and eventually my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted off. A few years ago, when I was in high school, my history class took a trip to Belgium. We were all GCSE students, excited for the adventure ahead. But little did we know, this trip would turn out to be one we'd never forget, for all the wrong reasons. It all began when our bus pulled up to a rundown motel on the outskirts of a small town. The building looked ancient, with paint peeling off the walls and ivy creeping up the sides. Our teacher, Mr. Thompson, assured us it was the only place available for miles around, so we reluctantly filed inside. As we checked in, the receptionist gave us a set of keys with a warning to stay out of the basement. It was an odd request, but we shrugged it off, too eager to explore the town to dwell on it. We were assigned the only room on the top floor, which meant a long climb up creaky stairs. The hallway was dimly lit, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as we reached our room. Inside, the atmosphere was musty and stale. The furniture looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and the curtains were threadbare, barely keeping out the fading light. We quickly claimed our beds, but no one seemed eager to explore the rest of the motel. As night fell, the darkness outside seemed to seep into our room, making it feel even more claustrophobic. Mr. Thompson tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we order some food and watch a movie, but the tension lingered in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the curtains sent shivers down my spine. And when someone mentioned needing to use the bathroom, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The bathroom was small and dingy, with cracked tiles and flickering lights. I hesitated to go in alone, but my bladder won out over my fear. As I washed my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if someone, or something, was lurking just beyond the cracked door. I hurried back to the safety of our room, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. But when I mentioned it to my classmates, they laughed it off, attributing it to nerves and the creepy surroundings. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, strange noises echoed through the halls, and a chill settled over the room that had nothing to do with the weather outside. We tried to rationalize it away, blaming it on the old building and our overactive imaginations. But deep down, we all knew something was wrong. Then, just as we were starting to relax and drift off to sleep, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. We all shot up in bed, hearts pounding as we listened to the sound echoing through the motel. Without a word, we all scrambled out of bed and huddled together in the center of the room, too terrified to move. Thompson tried to reassure us, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. We debated calling the police, but without knowing where the scream had come from, we were hesitant to leave the safety of our room. So we sat in terrified silence, listening for any sign of danger. But as the minutes turned into hours, the fear began to fade, replaced by a sense of exhaustion. Eventually, we drifted off to sleep, too tired to keep our eyes open any longer. When we woke up the next morning, the motel was eerily quiet. There were no signs of the commotion from the night before, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had happened. We gathered our things in silence, too shaken to speak. As we made our way back to the bus, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving something behind, something dark and sinister lurking in the shadows of that rundown motel. As we drove away, I glanced back at the building, feeling a chill run down my spine. As we disappeared around a bend in the road, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay hidden in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered by unsuspecting travelers like us. I do night deliveries for a food service to make some extra money. Most of the time, I work on Fridays and Saturdays because those are the nights people order food the most. One Saturday around 1 a.m., I got a message to Ever McDonald's to a guy named Jake. He lived a short drive away from where I was. I drove to the nearest McDonald's, which was only 2 minutes away. Jake's order was small, just 2 burgers. His place was about 5 to 7 minutes from the McDonald's. I followed the directions on the app, and it led me to a tiny dead-end street that connected to another dead-end street. Jake's house was the very last one on this street. His house sat next to some trees along a quiet highway. Since it was so late, I didn't want to ring the bell, so I called Jake. He didn't pick up, and it went straight to voicemail. But then he texted me telling me to come to the door. So I did. I reached his big wooden porch, and when the front door opened, Mark stood there. He was bald and looked like he was in his 30s. His head was completely bald, but I didn't judge him for it. He might have liked the look or had a health issue. But something was off. His breath smelled bad and he seemed drunk. Usually payments are made through the app, so there's no need to wait around for extra money. But this time Mark asked me to put the food on his kitchen table while he went to get a tip. I didn't mind. Free money is always good. So I waited in his kitchen, which was pretty dim with only a small nightlight. The whole kitchen smelled weird, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Mark was taking a long time down in the basement getting the tip, so I started to explore a bit. I went into the living room next to the kitchen where the TV was on, and that's when I noticed the smell was even stronger there. The door to another room was half open, maybe to let out the smell, just out of curiosity. I went to the back door thinking I'd get a breath of fresh air. But it was worse outside. I stepped onto his back deck and I heard flies buzzing around. Then a light turned on and I saw 2 big garbage bags with something long inside. It took a moment to realize I might be looking at something serious. Suddenly waiting for a tip didn't feel right. So I said I was checking if I had something in my car. He said okay. And as she handed me the money, he looked at the back door. Then he looked back at me and his smile disappeared, asked in a serious voice if I went to his backyard. I said no. He just stared at me without saying anything. I didn't want to deal with this anymore. I opened the door and walked out, and he grabbed my shoulder as I stepped onto the stoop. I pulled away and ran to my car. I saw him run back inside with the front door still open. I turned on my car, but I sat there watching his front door to see if he'd come back out. And he did. He came out running with a big metal rod in his hand. I drove away from his house ready to call the police and report him. I called them when I got down the block, making sure he didn't have time to hide anything. I waited and saw police cars show up in just 2 minutes. I watched everything as I told the police where to go. Mark, or whatever his name was, had started moving the bags which did have dead bodies to the bushes in his backyard. Everything about this guy was strange. From leaving the back door open to showing a delivery guy something so messed up. He might have been up in the head, but he wasn't very smart either. The police handled it from there, and I was just glad I got out of that situation. I used to work in a motel. It wasn't fancy, just a place for weary travelers to rest their heads for a night or two. Most of the time, my job was simple. Check guests in, clean rooms, and make sure everything ran smoothly. But one night in London, everything changed. It was a chilly evening, the kind that sends shivers down your spine, even if you're indoors. The lobby was quiet, with only the faint hum of the heater breaking the silence. I was sitting behind the front desk, flipping through a magazine to pass the time. That's when he walked in, a strange man with wild eyes and disheveled hair. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a certain darkness about him that made my skin crawl. He approached the desk, his steps uneven, and asked for a room. I hesitated for a moment, but the motel wasn't exactly bustling with customers, so I handed him a key and pointed him toward his room. He muttered his thanks and shuffled off down the hallway. I thought that was the last I'd see of him, but I was wrong. As the night wore on, I started to hear strange noises coming from the rooms. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around, but when I went to investigate, everything was still. Then, just as I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, I heard a knock on the door of the room I had assigned to the strange man. I hesitated, wondering if I should answer it, but something told me I had to. I opened the door slowly, and there he was, the strange man standing in the hallway with a manic grin on his face. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't say anything, just pushed past me and stumbled into the room. I followed him, trying to figure out what he was up to. But when I stepped inside, I froze. He was standing by the bed, staring down at it with a look of pure madness in his eyes. And then, without warning, he climbed onto the mattress and started tearing at the sheets, as if searching for something. I tried to reason with him, to get him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept muttering to himself, his hands shaking as he tore the room apart. I didn't know what to do. I was just a motel clerk, not equipped to handle something like this. But I knew I had to do something before he caused any more damage. I reached for the phone on the bedside table, intending to call the police, but before I could even pick it up, I heard another knock on the door. This time, it was my friend Jack. Jack was a big guy with a no-nonsense attitude that made him perfect for diffusing tense situations. He took one look at the scene before him and didn't hesitate. "Hey, buddy," he said, stepping into the room with a calmness that belied the chaos around us. "Why don't you come with me? We can talk about whatever's bothering you." But the strange man wasn't interested in talking. He lunged at Jack, his fists flying, and before I knew it, they were locked in a violent struggle. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen in fear, as they fought inches away from me. But then, suddenly, Jack managed to overpower the man and pin him to the ground. "Call the police," he grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Now, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed the phone and dialed 999, trying to explain the situation as calmly as I could. Within minutes, sirens were wailing outside, and a team of officers burst into the room. They quickly subdued the strange man, dragging him away in handcuffs as he screamed and thrashed against them. And just like that, it was over. The rest of the night passed in a blur of statements and paperwork. The police took my statement, Jack's statement, and even the statements of a few other guests who had been disturbed by the commotion. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. Who was that strange man, and what had driven him to such madness? I may never know the answers to those questions, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night in the motel in London. It was a night of fear and chaos, but thanks to Jack, we all ended up okay in the end. It was a dark, chilly evening, and I was driving alone on the deserted road. My job as a delivery driver often took me through remote areas like this, but I never felt uneasy before. As I cruised down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw a woman sitting in the passenger seat of a car next to me. Her hair was twisted into a tight bun, just like Miss Trunchbull from that movie. But what caught my attention was her terrified expression. She stared at me with wide eyes, as if she had seen a ghost. Before I could react, the car abruptly veered off at the next exit, leaving me bewildered. I shook my head, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up my spine, but the encounter lingered in my mind as I continued my journey. About half an hour later, another car pulled up alongside me. This time, the driver was different, but the woman in the passenger seat was the same. Her hair was still in that tight bun, and her expression remained frozen in fear. It was unnerving to see her again, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pull over at the next rest stop to report the strange sightings to the authorities. But before I could make a move, the car disappeared into the darkness. I cursed under my breath, feeling frustrated and helpless. I continued driving, my senses on high alert. Hours passed, and I was nearing London when it happened again. The same car, the same woman, the same terrified expression. But this time, something was different. She seemed to be screaming at me, her mouth forming silent words of desperation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched her. Without hesitation, I pulled over into a nearby lay-by and dialed the emergency number. My heart raced as I recounted the bizarre encounters to the dispatcher. To my relief, they informed me that they had received similar reports from other drivers in the area. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that engulfed me. What was happening? Who was the woman in the car, and why did she look so terrified? Minutes felt like hours, as I sat alone in the darkness, the only sound being the distant hum of passing cars. When the police finally arrived, I eagerly shared every detail of my encounters with them. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any trace of the mysterious woman or the car. I drove home that night with a heavy heart, haunted by the memory of the woman's terrified face. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had witnessed something otherworldly, something beyond my comprehension. In the days that followed, I scoured the news for any mention of the strange sightings, but there was nothing. It was as if the encounters had never happened, as if I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something sinister lurking on that desolate highway, something that defied logic and reason. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had come face to face with the supernatural that night. From that day on, I avoided driving alone on deserted highways, always keeping an eye out for any sign of the mysterious woman with the haunted expression. But no matter how far I drove, her image remained etched in my mind, a chilling reminder of the night I encountered something beyond my understanding. As I looked back on that fateful night, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all just a coincidence? Or had I stumbled upon a glimpse of the unknown, a glimpse of the things that lurk in the shadows, unseen and unexplained.